Chapter 6:19. The most favored and favored child of the Mother Goddess, the Elves. If the Creator Goddess herself favored the elves, then the elves would doubtlessly be the most favored child. Beautiful appearances, long lifespans, powerful and favored natural talents, the possibility of dual cultivation in magic and martial arts, and the extraordinary potential of the superior elves and royal elves. All of this was the favor of the Creator Goddess. And this favor also created a unique elven culture. The elves' natural talents in combat and long lifespans allowed them to reach the peak of the multiverse in terms of magic and martial arts. The elves also created a society with a strict hierarchy and a strict division of labor. Their natural beauty coupled with their sensitivity and relentless pursuit of beautiful things caused their art, music, literature to reach the point of extravagance and waste. This also allowed them to have a long history of their racial culture, which allowed them to survive the long ice age without falling apart. The elves were the most favored child of the Creator Goddess. This was a truth that no living creature could deny. No civilization had as long a history as the elves. The oldest gold elves were the gold citizens born alongside the first immemorial dragons and demons. It could be said that they were born at the very beginning of creation. In the elves' history, they had fought against the great demons and exchanged technology with the Heletum generation. They had even taught ancient and modern humans what magic was. The elves' glory was far, far too long. Don't discuss history and art in front of the elves, just like don't brag about your courage in front of the beastmen. This ancient saying explained many things. The Holy War was cruel. Other ruling species lost their status as main characters and would often disappear in history, such as the Great Demon Empire, the Heletum generation, the Dwarven Empire, and the Undead Republic. However, the elves, who had experienced multiple holy wars, only gradually retreated from history. This wasn't only because of the Creator Goddess' favor and the potential of their species. It was also because the elves were quite skilled at interacting with other species. In many crucial moments in history, they stood on the side of the victors. The Undead Republic, the Heletum generation, and the modern human mage country had all received the elves' favor in some way. Under the guidance of the Gold Elves, the Elven Empire had always been inexplicably friendly to all new species apart from the great demons. But perhaps it was precisely because of this rather weak way of doing things that the Gold Elves were gradually opposed by the superior elves who desired greater glory and eternal life. Why do we have to lower our heads to those lowly monkeys? Why do we have to move to the forests and mountains? Why can't we just eliminate those inferior races? As time passed and the elemental tide came and went, the Gold Elves, just like the other ancient races, entered their final stages. The decrease in elemental power caused the fertility rate of the Gold Elves, an ancient race, to gradually decrease. During the last generation, the birth of every Gold Elf was enough for the Empire to hold the grandest celebration ceremony. On the other hand, the Holy Wars and other species wars had caused the death of many top-level Gold Elf, undying individuals. Their mental decline caused the elves of the older generation to fall into eternal slumber. The younger generation was lacking, so the other inferior and superior elves naturally began to occupy the upper echelons of society. Doesn't it look familiar? Indeed, the current Moon Elf and Silver Elf society was facing the same problem. Now that the lower species numbers and quality had increased, it was only natural that they disliked the higher species that were becoming weaker and weaker. This had nothing to do with the higher species making foolish decisions. It was simply because society was changing and the power balance of all social classes had been rebalanced. The new mainstream social class had chosen a new representative. Just like how a change in productivity would result in a change in society, in a magical world, a change in the upper echelons' combat strength and strategic leaders would naturally result in a change in society. Or perhaps it could be said that the entire society was calling for change. At this time, no matter what the Gold Elves did, it would always be wrong. And so, the superior elves who held the banner of freedom collectively rebelled. This great rebellion wasn't just a matter of the mortal plane. The elven gods' great reshuffling of power was the key. The final result was the complete destruction of the gold elves. The gods and mortals all died. Only Harlois was able to reawaken several hundred years later, but everything had changed. However, the gold elves who had ruled over the elves for countless years were obviously intelligent. Even if they absolutely had to delegate power, the gold elves handed over the most important military, religious, and diplomatic matters to different superior elves. Although this political structure caused the superior elves to form their own factions, it also caused them to restrict each other. And this also caused the future destruction of the gold elves. After the gold elves, the most powerful existence among the gold elves, collapsed, the four superior elves, who were about the same level of power, faced the biggest headache of all. The difference in power between the four superior elves wasn't that great, and none of them were willing to become subordinates. However, it would be far too foolish to immediately draw their swords against the gold elves. That was why the gold elves' parliament system and the senate system became their only choices. The result? The elven tribes and the kingdom of the elves were the best evidence of this. Some things only needed to be seen in the end. The elves went from prosperity to decline. The turning point was the collapse of the elven empire. Without the gold elves as a stabilizing force, everything began to go out of control. The dark elves and Rose were exiled from the elven empire as losers. The wood elves and the Drool alliance left the elven empire and joined the neutral nature faction. The other superior elves fought against the wood elves, and the moon elves broke off relations with the silver elves. If the gold elves were still around, none of this would have happened. When the gold elves defeated the gold elves, the superior elves and the elven gods became extremely arrogant after tasting the joy of victory and power. They all believed that they could replace the weak and corrupt gold elves and lead the elves to a better future. And then, the superior elves, who had different natures to begin with, began to interfere in each other's domains. The constant friction finally escalated into a civil war, which was followed by a holy war that forced the elven empire to revert to a tribal system. Very few species could compare to the superior elves in terms of speed of squandering. Of course, the superior elves themselves would never admit that everything was the fault of others, the fault of the world, the gold elves' scheme. Although the gold elves were partially responsible for all of this, it was still quite pitiful for the superior elves to be dug up and implicated even after death. Everyone was quite happy when the superior elves split off from the elven empire. However, as the superior elves became more and more difficult, it was only natural that some would reminisce about the old elven empire. As the entire species was surpassed by humans and other short-lived monkeys, the superior elves became more and more marginalized. The superior elves' lives became more and more difficult, and they began to reminisce about the elven empire. As more and more difficult times accumulated, more and more superior elves reminisced about their past glory. Some ancient existences felt that this was quite the irony of fate. And now, the superior elves had once again reached a turning point in their fate. The moon elves had officially established a new elven empire. This could be said to have fulfilled their long-cherished wish. And now, this long-cherished wish was indeed quite meaningful. First of all, the Moonwheel capital was nominally ruling over all the elven empire. In that case, if the Moonwheel capital was threatened, wouldn't all the powerful elves be responsible for saving the Moonwheel capital? And if someone escaped from the Moonwheel capital at such a time, wouldn't that person be called a deserter, a shameless traitor to the Moonwheel capital? The answer would definitely be yes. There would always be old-fashioned and dogmatic elves among the elves. The moon elves still hadn't given up hope. They desired even the slightest shred of hope. Every day, countless reinforcements would arrive at the Moonwheel capital from all over the world. There would be wood elf drool and rangers who walked out of the forest. There would also be half-elf and human mercenaries who admired the elven empire's culture. There would also be young warriors who desired glory and achievement. Perhaps there's a mistake in the information? Perhaps the demon wave isn't as hopeless as recorded in history? Perhaps we still have reinforcement. We have the God's blessing. We'll be able to survive this demon wave. We'll be able to survive this calamity. Perhaps this type of luck seemed quite foolish. But if one thought about it from the Moon Elves' perspective, what would happen if there was an incredibly accurate prophecy that an island country on Earth would sink into the ocean in 10 days? Since there were too many Moon Elves and too little time, there wouldn't be enough time to escape. And even if the Moon Elves escaped to other countries and were kindly accepted as refugees, the Moon Elves' country would be completely destroyed. Even their homeland would be gone. Would the Moon Elves still exist? And even if the Moon Elves still existed, would they still be free? And if the Moon Elves were surrounded by enemies on all sides, and the Moon Elves were the most valuable slaves in the eyes of the humans, the actual situation would be even scarier than what the humans had predicted. If the Moon Elves truly escaped, with countless Moon Elves chaotically fleeing to other countries, wouldn't more than 10 human slave-hunting squads suddenly appear on the humans' borders? Would they rely on the human nobles' morals and shamelessness? To be honest, this was far too difficult a decision to make. But no matter how one looked at it, no matter what decision the Moon Elves made, it would be a scene of despair. If the Moon Elves decided to escape, that would be the equivalent of prematurely announcing the end of the Moon Elf Empire. The elven calamity and human calamity that would follow would be a heavy historical responsibility that none of the Moon Elves would be able to shoulder. In the Moon Elves' eyes, this would be the equivalent of a slow death for the entire Moon Elf Empire. It would be far better for the Moon Elves to unite and face the Armageddon together. In fact, due to various wishful thinking, there were already rumors that the demon wave wouldn't appear in the Moonwheel capital. This was only a rumor spread by the humans in order to destroy the Moon Elf Empire. Actually, as these rumors spread, many people actually believed them. After all, people always liked to hear things that were beneficial to them. Now, the entire Moon Elf Empire was astonished by the Moon Elves. The Moon Elves actually didn't refute the rumors. This seemed like the Moon Elves' tacit agreement. The Moon Elves were actually pretending that everything was peaceful? The Moon Elves' attitude was quite clear. At the very least, I had rebuilt the Moon Elf Empire and left a mark in history. If I could survive this, I would have profited greatly. And, if I could use righteousness to attract more reinforcements, perhaps the Moon Elves' chances of surviving this crisis would also greatly increase. But, in the eyes of some, such wishful thinking was the most foolish of all. You had already fallen into a trap, so was it really fun to drag others down with you and die together? At such a time, the most rational thing to do would naturally be to shout, "Don't worry about me," and then obediently jump into the trap and die. Only then would the Moon Elves be able to preserve the Moon Elves' bones and blood. But, there were many times, especially when one's life was threatened, when an intelligent creature's emotions would far surpass their rationality. Perhaps the Moon Elves who had split off from the Moon Elves had seen through all of this, which was why they had chosen to head north. But, it seemed that it was already too late for them. Perhaps the Creator Goddess didn't want to see the Moon Elves completely destroyed, which was why she activated the invisible hand of fate to help the Moon Elves at such a critical moment. "Roland, come here for a moment. I've discovered something that's quite interesting." I was also rather astonished to hear Harlowe's exclamation. That was because our soul connection was a rare surprise and delight. What could possibly make someone as knowledgeable as Harlowe so happy? I wasn't really looking forward to the Succubus Demon Lord's treasure trove. That was because the Succubus Demon Lords all had the habit of never leaving their true treasures in their own homes. Otherwise, their enemies would rob them, and they would lose both their lives and their wealth. Fine then, I admit that I had also dug up a bunch of treasure troves and drawn a bunch of real and fake treasure maps. As for my family's treasure trove, I would at least leave something behind so that others wouldn't be able to return empty-handed and kill others to vent their anger. After all, nobody could truly guard against thieves forever. I looked at Didina in astonishment. I hadn't expected her to be so new. But, judging from the undisguised astonishment on her face, it seemed that she hadn't expected this either. I walked into the treasure trove and, as expected, saw a bunch of blinding gold coins. However, I didn't even need to appraise them. Those gold coins were either the dwarf's fantasy gold coins or the devil's cursed gold coins. Instead, Harlois and Marguerite were busying themselves with some tattered antique furniture amidst the golden light. Amidst the golden light, Harlois was constantly wiping a white oak classical dressing table with a wet towel. "Roland, this is my dressing table from back in the day." Harlois only showed it to me as if it was a treasure. Perhaps it was because she was too excited to see her own items from back in the day, but even her mental age seemed to have regressed. "You came looking for me just for such a small matter?" I said angrily. Yes. Even furniture from back in the day can be considered a mega-antique. You've once again proven that you're as old as a fossil. Isn't that strange? Normally, the silly cat would have transformed into a flying cat and tried to bite me by now. But today, she seemed rather excited and strange. "Humph, I knew you wouldn't know what's good for you. Watch." Harlois stood in front of the dressing table's mirror. Even though she had transformed into her adult form, the image in the tattered mirror was that of a golden-haired young elf. She took a deep breath and lightly tapped the mirror with her finger, causing ripples to appear. Harlois touched her neck, and the girl in the mirror did the same. However, a golden sapphire necklace appeared. The next instant, an identical golden necklace appeared on Harlois' neck as well. Harlois playfully tapped her forehead, causing a small and cute golden crown to appear on her forehead. She reached out her hand and shook it in front of the mirror. No matter if it was inside or outside the mirror, a golden scepter appeared. Avis Ter, the Elven Emperor's will, and the final golden crown. 3 pieces of the gold elf royalty's god equipment set. The lost proof of the Elven Emperor. Didina actually recognized this treasure that had long since disappeared in history. I re-evaluated her age and value. But at this moment I mysteriously felt that something was wrong with the situation, as if some super troublesome matter was currently bothering me. I should have been pleasantly surprised to see Harlois smiling so brightly. However, this series of coincidences caused me to mysteriously recall my previous conversation with Cadio, the former god of fate. "Cadio, can you really control your own fate? Then, can you help me change my fate? I don't need any fortune. Just give me some luck with women, a slightly more normal woman. I think it's rather embarrassing. Can I pretend that I don't know you?" Back then, the Hades had already been established. Cadio was in a rather good mood, so he even joked around with me. However, I really wasn't joking at the time. My adopted daughter was already so old that she was still an old virgin. This wouldn't just be embarrassing, it would be a tragedy. All I wanted was a normal girlfriend, a normal family, and 2 normal children. Was that too much? But then, Cadio became serious. Since I was talking about fate, I needed to be serious. Change your fate? Perhaps it's possible for others, but it's impossible for you. Every individual is tied down by countless threads of karma. They shout that they're free from fate, but they don't know that that's also a part of fate. Every existence has their own fate. Some may live an ordinary life, while others may live a heroic life. But in the river of fate, there's no foundational difference. These are the threads of fate. They're determined at the moment of their birth. Cadio glanced at me playfully as I said this. It seemed that he was hinting at something. As the guardian of the Church of Fate and the River of Fate, I can cut and reconnect the threads of karma. But, if I give an individual good luck, I naturally have to give them the same amount of bad luck. This is the most basic rule of fate. There's a limit to how much I can change my fate. I can observe other people's fate threads while I'm in the river of fate, but I'll automatically forget them after I leave. I can't reveal any of them. No matter what changes I make, it's all a part of fate. I was delighted to hear this instead of being shocked. Fortune doesn't matter. Luck with women is enough. Perhaps this can count as changing fate. As for you, you weren't in the river of fate to begin with. You can change the fate of those around you, but you don't have any good luck or bad luck. You should be unlucky, or you could even say that you have the worst luck. Even now, I could still remember how he looked at me with incomprehensible sympathy. I can connect other people's fate threads to you, but that's the same as challenging the most basic rule of the river of fate. I'll toss karma into the void. In the end, not only will I be punished, my luck with women will definitely become a calamity with women. Then what's the use of you? The god of fate is actually so useless? And to think that you're a powerful god. You're so useless. At the time, I was so displeased that I even cursed him out loud. However, Cadio only chuckled at me. Yes, in front of the formless and invisible hand of fate, in front of the inevitable combination of countless coincidences, the god of fate is indeed quite useless. Even though he was clearly talking about his own helplessness, the god of fate seemed to be bragging about the greatness of fate. No matter how much I change or plan, I won't be able to resist fate's arrangements. Roland, let me give you a piece of advice. Perhaps you aren't in the river of fate, but the people and things you're connected to are in the river of fate. Unless you're willing to cut off all your connections, you'll never be able to escape. His playful smile caused my scalp to go numb. I once again confirmed that I hated scammers the most in the world, especially scammers who didn't finish their sentences. Right now, I felt my scalp go numb even more as I watched Harloise show off her treasures to others. Damn scammer, how did I get scammed this time? Chapter 620. Other people would pick up a system, a grandpa, or a mystical ring. Then, they would cancel their engagement, slap themselves in the face, level up, and transform trash into geniuses. In the end, they would either fight to destroy the world or start a harem. How enviable! I meant speechless. As for me, if I picked up some kind of treasure, some kind of inexplicable good luck with women, my first reaction would be that the treasure was definitely a trap, and I needed to be careful. After good luck came double the bad luck, and I needed to be careful. Good luck with women that came knocking on my door was either a dinosaur, a peach blossom calamity, or a trap. Even worse, based on my many years of experience, I wasn't being paranoid at all. I was simply making predictions based on my own experience. My many years of experience with being tricked made my first reaction upon seeing this famous 3-piece god equipment set. Throw it away, hurry up and throw it away. I just randomly picked up a 3-piece god equipment set. Am I going to be unlucky for the next 100 years? Don't compare me to you. My luck has always been excellent. Harloise proudly adjusted the positions of the 3-god equipment set. She even conjured an extravagant gold and white dress and a perfect adult body. She then began to dress herself up in front of a mirror. Is it beautiful? Harloise started spinning in front of me. The golden gemstones on her necklace emitted dreamy water vapor. The sparkling bubbles in the air reflected golden light. Together with the gold elf's perfect appearance and lifestyle, she was just like an elf princess from a fairy tale. She indeed had a pure, noble, and extravagant beauty that moved one's heart. She's indeed beautiful. She's the most beautiful I've ever seen. I wasn't an idiot. It was enough for me to tell the truth. I casually praised Harloise, but I kept feeling like some misfortune was about to befall me. Killing intent? As expected, there was killing intent. Who was ambushing me? Oh, it was Eliza. Were you glaring at me? Well, it didn't matter. I was already used to her words. Why was Eliza smiling? This smile doesn't feel right to me. Could it be that she's really determined to dismember me? Are you suffering from late-stage persecutory delusion? You're always thinking about the worst. No, I'm speaking from experience. If I pick up a wallet with 2 copper coins in it, I'll definitely lose 4 copper coins the next day. This is an actual example. Why are you all looking at me so strangely? You don't believe me? Heloise shook her head. No, we believe you. You really didn't lie. But with your luck, how could you pick up a wallet? I nodded proudly. Don't look down on me. Of course, I have picked up money before. I have even picked it up twice. I still remember that there were 2 Barty copper coins in there. That was the first time I'd ever picked up money. The next morning, I even ordered an extra egg pancake in celebration. Unfortunately, the next afternoon I was robbed again, and I even lost my money. The second time was more than 50 years ago. I picked up a silver coin. A silver coin. I couldn't even believe it. Unfortunately, I lost it that very night. Why are you all looking at me with such sympathy? This was the truth. I'm not bragging. It's because it's the truth that I pity you. It's not easy for you to live. Recalling what I just said, I squatted on the ground in frustration. I'd self-destructed again. However, Heloise chuckled. I finally understand why your disgusting fighting style of constantly gathering information, gradually calculating and calculating, accumulating advantages, and then forcing your opponent to the brink of despair before crushing them all came about. No matter how low the chance of failure is, it'll still happen if you're unlucky. Your way of doing things is probably to reduce the element of unknown and luck as much as possible. You're forced to treat a 1% chance of failure as 100%, and you don't expect any luck at all. How pitiful. What did you say? I don't understand. Right, why is your furniture in the chaos abyss? Although you're still such a lousy way of changing the topic, I also want to know why my dressing table is here, so I'll let you off the hook. Many gazes were directed at Chaos Lord Didina, who had been pretending to be her background all this time. I had originally thought that she would be quite depressed that she had missed out on this god equipment after having it by her side for so many years. However, she simply smiled as if she didn't care. These are all random pieces of furniture that I bought back when I first became the Chaos Lord to fill up my treasury. I don't even remember where I bought them from. It's probably a merchant from another plane, and he came with the furniture. There was also some furniture in my treasury. Most of the furniture was Elven style. It would seem that they were all super antiques from the Elven Empire's era. Indeed, many antique collectors loved artwork from the Elven Empire's era. These pieces of furniture would probably be quite valuable. However, no matter if it was in terms of quality or craftsmanship, these pieces of furniture couldn't compare to Heloise's dressing table. After all, items used by royalty were all incredibly rare. No, wait, I remember that the royal palace was burned to the ground. I thought that the 3 god equipment would be forever lost along with the destruction of the royal palace, unless someone stole my dressing table before the destruction. However, someone who would steal my dressing table alone would naturally know its value. Would such a person really sell my dressing table? Heloise's intelligence finally returned to normal for once, as if she had finally recovered from the joy of obtaining the most valuable treasures. However, the moment that she said this, Didina's expression changed. She suddenly retreated, but a small red dragon suddenly landed on her head. The flames that burned her hair told Didina that any random action would result in her death. I took a closer look at this treasury. Treasures were piled up like a mountain. There was a pile of old and tattered furniture in the corner. If I had been a reckless invader, perhaps I would have taken all the treasures with me. However, I wouldn't have even bothered to look at this heavy pile of furniture, nor would I have been able to find a relatively valuable dressing table among them. If I had been an experienced invader, I wouldn't have had much hope for this treasure trove from the very start. Forcing this succubus to reveal the true location of the treasure trove would have been the most likely outcome. I would have ignored all the furniture from the very start. I had to say, If it wasn't for the fact that Heloise recognized her own items, we would have missed them as well. If this was all intentional, then this was truly a brilliant arrangement. No matter who the invader was, they would always ignore the furniture. If all this had been arranged to conceal the existence of this dressing table, then it was highly likely that this succubus knew the importance of this dressing table from the very start. Heloise, this should be the royalty's greatest secret, right? You probably wouldn't know much about the value of this dressing table. Yet, Heloise didn't give me a clear answer. However, her beautiful eyes were already locked onto Didina. I had never seen such a serious expression before, which surprised even me. It would seem that Heloise was being serious for once. As long as that succubus dared to run, Heloise would turn her into a sitting duck even without Little Red interfering from above. I was becoming more and more interested in this succubus background. Just as I was about to properly interrogate this succubus, the door to my room suddenly opened, and a small fairy suddenly flew in. "Your Highness Roland, you have an urgent report. Extremely urgent. Extremely urgent." Chapter 6:21. Tell me, is it your fault that misfortune has spread to me as well? Harlois's beautiful face was right in front of me. She was jumping on my head, and it was quite cute to see her fangs rubbing together. Her vicious expression made it seem like she wanted to directly bite me, but I found it quite funny. "Haha, I'm the one who wants you to laugh at me. You little brat, you deserve this." Alright then, I really did laugh out loud. I laughed arrogantly and domineeringly, and I laughed so hard that I rolled on the ground. But right after that, I crouched on the ground in frustration, because I instantly realized that since Harloise was bound to me, her troubles were my troubles as well. In the end, I was laughing at myself for being the unlucky one. Now, the Northland's Mist Alliance saw that my family couldn't make up their minds, so they pushed their troubles onto me. Who taught them to be so irresponsible? Harloise, it's you. In the end, I became the scapegoat again, and this scapegoat was related to the survival of an entire species. I couldn't take this scapegoat. This is all your scapegoat. If it wasn't for you digging out the information and shamelessly tossing it to the elves in the mortal plane, wouldn't this have happened? It's because you don't want to take responsibility that you're the scapegoat. Actually, this logic was quite reasonable. If I hadn't obtained the information, the elves wouldn't have gone crazy, and they wouldn't have forced me to take the scapegoat. Why was I taking the scapegoat? Actually, they didn't need me to give them any advice at all. Right now, they only had two choices. They could either accept the Silver Elves and create an elven empire in the Northlands, giving the elves a way out, or they could watch as the elves messed around and prepare to collect their corpses. The former would cause a major division among the elves, and it would likely be permanent. The latter would be doing nothing to save the elves. No matter what decision I made, I would become the mortal enemy of some elves. Perhaps I would even be given the title of Destroyer of the Elves, or Destroyer of the Elven Empire. If this wasn't taking the scapegoat, what would it be? The demon wave was about to arrive, and the elves were about to meet their doom. However, the elves' behavior had once again surpassed my understanding of how low they could go. Actually, the most rational and effective method right now was to directly disband all of the elven tribes and destroy the wariness of the surrounding human kingdoms. Then, they would organize a great escape. It didn't matter if they became slaves or refugees. They would escape as far as they could and do their best to preserve the elven bloodline. As long as there were enough elven survivors, there might be a day when they could rebuild their homeland. Even if you adults aren't afraid of death, you can organize the elderly and children to escape. If it's just the children and the elderly, other countries will also accept such refugees. However, the elven leader who made this decision would probably become famous in history for destroying his own country and people. He would also become a sinner for personally destroying the elven empire's ideals. But in this day and age, weren't leaders supposed to be professionals at being scolded and blamed? He didn't even have the slightest bit of backbone. He couldn't even compare to a single finger of the foolish King Orlos. Right now, the elves' decision seemed generous. None of us will escape. However, it was actually the equivalent of, everyone will die together. If the demon wave was as frightening as the legends said, then it would be the same as waiting for the elves' destruction. Actually, based on our calculations, the demon wave's power level would probably be able to break all of history's record. At that time, not only would the elves be unlucky, even the neighboring human kingdoms that were currently rejoicing in the elves' misfortune would likely be destroyed as well. Even if the elves started a great escape right now and all the human kingdoms along the way opened up a path, they still might not be able to escape. I was no saint, and I had a grudge against the elves. However, I really didn't want to see the entire elven species be destroyed. Apart from the fact that if the lips were gone, the teeth would be interdependent, there was another reason that no one knew about. Indeed, the elves aren't strong right now. But in another 20 years, no, 10 years, they'll welcome a super golden age. Was that inconceivable? Actually, in my eyes, the elves had the most potential out of all the species. In fact, it was even possible that the elves would rise again in the Holy War. The reason for this was because of the Battle of the Hades 8 years ago. Many things that happened in that year were destined to be recorded in history. However, there were also many things that didn't happen immediately. Those things needed time to settle. That year, the god of fate, the god of wealth, and the other gods of the Hades chose to enter the Hades. The moment that they entered the Hades, they gave up on their old divine kingdoms and Valkyrie temples. Countless Valkyrie were scattered in the mortal plane. Those new generation's dawn children coincidentally met with a new cycle of reincarnation and a new cycle of reincarnation. They were saved from having their memories erased in the cycle of reincarnation, becoming the luckiest reincarnators. When the gods of the Hades discovered that the gods of the Hades had cheated, many gods hurriedly did the exact same thing. The dawn generation, Valkyrie reincarnation, and undead transforming into demons weren't all that different in theory. They were both undead transforming into living beings. However, unlike my revival, the new Valkyrie reincarnation would be a brand new life. They would only have their past memories and knowledge. Fundamentally, they would still be two different people. Perhaps they couldn't compare to their previous lives, but they would have the experience and knowledge of a hero as their starting point. As long as they didn't die midway, their achievements wouldn't be too bad. Even if a myth-ranked hero couldn't surpass their previous lives, it wouldn't be too difficult for them to become a legend. Then, what did this mean? This meant that within 10 or 20 years, the replicas of those historical heroes would appear in every corner of the continent. He would enter a new generation of heroes. This was our ultimate defense against the Chaos faction. Perhaps it wouldn't be effective in the short term, but it would definitely increase the overall combat strength of He. Perhaps a single hero wouldn't be able to change the outcome of a battle, but defending a village shouldn't be too difficult. And among these heroes, at least 1/3 were elves. The reason? The elves had the longest history and had the most heroes. Was that enough? Apart from that, there was another coincidental reason that made me speechless. Elven main god Anslo just happened to choose to betray the Order faction at that time. His Valkyrie temple was filled with elves. A main god had accumulated countless years of Valkyrie. I couldn't even begin to imagine just how many future mega seeds there were in Valkyrie. I didn't think that Anslo would be able to think so much in such a short period of time. It was mostly luck. Still, it really seemed like the heavens were protecting the elves. According to the basic rules of reincarnation, the souls of the elves would always choose to reincarnate in other elves. The location where the demon wave was about to descend would be the largest elven gathering in the world. If the Moonwheel capital's elven land was destroyed by the demon wave, countless future heroes would be killed in the cradle. From this standpoint, the demon wave had truly chosen the correct location to begin. Damn it, I need to change my plans. Not to mention Renee, even I might not be able to deal with this situation myself. Originally, I had a plan for the future heroes of the elves. When I notified the mortal plane about the demon wave, I had contacted Renee and told her to take the new Polaris airship fleet to the Moonwheel capital, saying that they were there to rescue the elves. Of course, the real purpose of this mission was to sell some weapons and purchase some magical items, which would count as some war profit. But the real purpose was actually for the sake of those young elves. Even the most valiant and fearless warrior would soften when talking about their children. Even if they were going to die, they wouldn't be willing to watch their children die with them. As long as Renee's Polaris airship fleet told everyone that they had sold out all their weapons, it would be meaningless to return to the Moonwheel capital empty-handed. Out of humanitarianism, the elves would be obligated to take the elves' children and elderly to live in the Northlands. Considering that the Northlands was the only place where elven slaves weren't sold, and that the Church of Law was known for being fair and just, it would be highly likely that they would be able to convince the elves. The Elven Queen wouldn't be able to force her own citizens to sacrifice their bloodline for the sake of glory. It would be impossible to stop her. Perhaps she would even kidnap a large number of royal or noble superior elf children. I also instructed the Polaris airship fleet not to be greedy and kidnap as many elves as possible. There was also no need to verify the information beforehand. It was fine to treat it as a good deed. It would be possible for the Polaris airship fleet to take 20,000 elves with them. But when the demon wave truly arrived, the Polaris airship fleet would use all sorts of illegal methods, such as ambushes and kidnappings. It would be quite easy for them to kidnap several tens of thousands more elves. This plan could be described as quite insidious, but the success rate would still be quite high. Not only would it preserve the elves' bloodline, it would also strengthen the Mist Alliance. It would be a win-win situation. But with the current situation, the elves would rather give their children to the humans as slaves than give them to the Northland's Elven Empire, which was fighting for the rightful throne. It was highly likely that Renee and the others would be banished the moment they entered the Northland's Elven Empire. No, I have to go personally. This will be quite difficult for Renee and the others to deal with. While I made up my mind, Harloise was quite likely to have a huge headache. For the sake of my human trafficker plan, it would be best not to establish an elven empire that would attract hostility from the elves. But when Harloise heard that there was a chance to re-establish an elven empire, her eyes lit up even though she didn't seem to mind it as trouble. Not only that, the Northland's elven empire would improve the Mist Alliance's overall strength if it was established. All the Northland's elves would have their own home, and countless elves would go to the Northlands. This was a rare opportunity that only appeared once every 10,000 years. If it wasn't for the fact that the moon elves and elven gods were so busy with their own affairs, how could the rightful throne possibly be destroyed? And it just so happened that Harloise obtained 3 god equipment that symbolized the Elven Empire's royal authority. If it wasn't for the fact that I personally witnessed this, it would have been nothing more than a joke of fate. But if news of this spread, everyone would probably think that this was a scheme of the Northland's elves. A princess of a destroyed country becomes an undead after her country is destroyed, and she wanders for 10,000 years with the national treasures. She then painstakingly revives and uses 3 national treasures to rebuild the Northland's Elven Empire. This is a classic story that will probably be repeated for several hundred years, with many doujinshi novels and dramas. At that time, no matter if this was a scheme or a golden elf conspiracy, the Northland's Elven Empire would instantly become the rightful throne as long as the Gold Elf Empire and the 3 national treasures appeared together. So many pieces of information spun around in my head that my head began to ache. I originally had a backup plan for all of them. Perhaps it could be called an evil plan, but none of them were anything honorable. Every plan had a different goal. As for which plan to use, that would depend on the person involved. Harloise, just what are you thinking? You still hate the elven gods? Do you want to destroy the elves? Or do you want to revive the elves and revive the entire elven empire? Of course I want revenge. Don't speak so quickly. Think about it carefully. You're the last descendant of the Gold Elves. Your decision will affect the future of all elves. Ask yourself, just what do you want? This is your responsibility. I didn't want to force her, but right now I had to force her to make a decision. Although it would be cruel, this was her responsibility. Harloise sunk into contemplation. By the time she spoke up again, she had probably already resolved herself. Chapter 6:22. A family was a combination of blood-related relatives, and a country was a collection of countless families of the same origin. They shared mutual interests and lived and died together. This was a mainstream concept that was quite suitable in some areas, but it was not suitable in Aichi. Compared to the relatively peaceful Earth, Aichi's living environment was much more dangerous. The threat of magical beasts and the hostility of other species made the basic requirement of survival extremely difficult. The countries on Earth could be grouped by race, ethnicity, and culture, but in Aichi, such a classification was too extravagant. In fact, the human race and ethnicity in Aichi also had countless subdivisions, but in the eyes of other species and gods, they were all just humans. The reason? There was no other reason. Life wasn't easy, and huddling together was the top priority. There was no time and energy, yet there was such a fine division. If Earth had been invaded by aliens for hundreds of years, there would probably be no discrimination or subdivision of race and ethnicity. In the face of a greater threat, this was meaningless. In such an environment, the country and social structure of Aichi were fundamentally different from that of Earth. The weak support and worship the strong, and the strong protect the weak. It was a simple symbiotic relationship, but it was the foundation of all social structures. The weak yearned to become the strong, and becoming the strong meant that they could stand out and obtain a higher status. While the strong gained power, they had to bear the responsibility of protecting the weak. Therefore, under such a social structure, the feudal aristocracy became the mainstream of the world, and from a certain point of view, this was indeed the most suitable social system in this world. From the very beginning, the knight lords who were in theft had the responsibility of becoming professional soldiers and protecting their own citizens. Would there be a great communist society after transmigrating? At the very least, there would be a capitalist class revolution and a constitutional monarchy? In that case, who would be responsible for protecting the entire race? Should they expect the commoners who had never practiced any martial arts or magic? The royal family and members of the royal family who relied on their bloodline would be taught military knowledge and the responsibility of protecting their family, country, and people from the moment of birth. This wasn't something noble or righteous, but purely a social division of labor brought about by the internal environment and external pressure. In this world, due to the existence of magic and martial arts, the gap between the strong and the weak was even more obvious. The division of labor between professional warriors and commoners gradually gave rise to the so-called knight nobility. The Son of Heaven guards the gates of the country, the king dies for the country, and the prince becomes the general. It's rather ancient. Then, what does this ancient refer to? Perhaps some things are common. Even in another world, when life was extremely difficult at the beginning, the so-called leaders were actually the military leaders of the tribes and clansmen. The Yen Emperor, the Yellow Emperor, and King One of the East, and the Arthur and Alexander of the West had all led armies into battle. However, the long era of peace and luxury had corrupted their descendants, causing them to rely on the achievements of their ancestors to enjoy themselves and forget their true duties. But even so, in the dark ages of the Middle Ages and the chaotic warring states period, the lords still had to fight for the future of themselves and their people. Compared to Earth, the situation in the Aichi continent was even more severe. Perhaps there were luxuries, but there had never been a long period of peace. The Holy War, other species, and magical beasts would forever be threats to every country and species. Perhaps the current human nobility had already become addicted to pleasure and luxury, or perhaps the superior elves had already focused their attention on power struggles, or perhaps the beastman tribe leaders had already returned to the primitive tribal system, but as long as their territory was invaded, they would still have to take up arms and lead their people to defend their home. In Aichi, nobles could be foolish, greedy, ignorant, and arrogant, but they definitely couldn't be useless or cowardly. If a domain lord abandoned his own territory and escaped when a threat arrived, not only would he lose his territory and title, he would also be looked down upon by everyone. This everyone included the lowest of farmers and criminals sentenced to death. In this aspect, perhaps the central countries of the continent, which had been at peace for a period of time, were somewhat lax. Their nobles and knight had indeed become corrupted. In this aspect, the short-lived humans were indeed inferior to the elves. But for me, who was born in the Northlands, it was as if my duty was right in front of me. Ever since I was born, the threat of the northern beastmen and the cruel natural environment reminded me that this wasn't a peaceful earth. This was Aichi, where people could die at any moment and entire species could be wiped out. As the heirs to the Mist Kingdom, Cavendish and I actually had a wooden sword as our first toy. Ever since we were young, we received knight training and military lessons. The great sword saint of the Royal Knight Order was our swordsmanship teacher. As the royal lecturer, Kelly didn't teach us about romance. Instead, she was extremely skilled at using historical anecdotes to teach children about politics and military matters. Being able to go to the battlefield before even reaching adulthood wasn't something that only Cavendish and I had experienced. Countless domain lords' heirs had experienced something like this. In fact, some places even viewed it as a type of test, using the law of the jungle to choose the best successor. Your territory and citizens will forever be a domain lord's root. The reason why the people support you and love you is because you protect them. Your territory and citizens will forever be a ruler's root. A tribe's territory and citizens will forever be a tribe leader's root. Such words could be extended to countless versions, from an ordinary mayor to a supreme emperor. This contract of protection and origin was the most basic relationship of trust in this world that was not peaceful. A noble status represented not only authority, but also the responsibility of a guardian. The glory of the Gold Elves' ancestors wasn't just for show. It was also something that needed to be inherited. I didn't know if the Gold Elves' education was the same as the human royalties, but at the very least, I didn't notice any difference in this aspect. Harlois, just what are you thinking? You still hate the elven gods? Do you want to destroy the elves? Or do you want to revive the elves and revive the entire elven empire? This was such a despicable and cruel question, because not only was it digging at one's scars, it was also forcing one to make a difficult choice. And I had known the answer from the very start. As the last descendant of the Gold Elves, Harlois wasn't the ruler of a destroyed country, but she had the fate of having her country destroyed. If she was still an undead filled with resentment, she would probably be shouting, "I want revenge! Let them all die!" Such words. But now that Harlois had been revived, I refused to believe that she hadn't thought about her responsibilities, as she was the only gold elf in existence. However, every time she thought about something like, "They won't accept me, an ancient royal daughter of the previous dynasty," or "What's the point of thinking about such meaningless things?" she would stop herself from thinking deeper. How did I know? Would anyone believe me if I told them that I had a similar status as the royalty of a destroyed country? Fine then, I had to admit that I had signed the magical pet contract far too hastily back then. Some random things would always come out of nowhere. I knew what Harlois' answer would be, just as Harlois knew that I knew what her answer would be. Although it seemed quite convoluted, that was how it was. So much time had passed since that incident. Although Harlois would enter a berserk state whenever the elves were mentioned, this meant that she had always been thinking about the elves. If she could describe her complex feelings for the elves in detail, it would probably be more than enough to write a series of romance novels. The long silence finally came to an end. How sly! Those bastards from back then must pay the price. Lies and bargaining would be meaningless when communicating with someone with a soul connection. What Harloise said was her bottom line. However, the Elven Empire had been destroyed more than 10,000 years ago, probably between the last 4 or 5 holy wars. As for the people involved, fine then, there were still some. Harloise had given me a small notebook with the names of the Elven gods' former members. Anslo and Rose were both at the top of the list. As for the mortal elves' enemies? Not to mention that gold elves didn't even have lifespans of 10,000 years, the pitiful survival rate of all the previous holy wars could be counted on one hand. Right, there was also the fact that Harloise had been hunting them down like a rabid dog for so many years. Not mentioning anything else, for the more than 100 years of Yongia, every time she encountered the kingdom of the elves, she would make a list of ancient elves to hunt down. No, there are 5 more. The Silver Elf Savar and Alcidin were both traders of the Silver Spear family. They were the former head guards of the Silver Spear family. The Moon Elf Finna Moonshadow was my father's most trusted priestess, but she blinded us. The Wild Elf Vincent, I must have been blind to have promoted that bastard back then. The Wood Elf, Ancient Tree Sleeper, was the one who forced all the ancient tree guards of the royal palace to sleep. Alright, not a single one of them was easy to deal with. They were all semi-god old-timers. After so many years, the Wood Elf elves, their families, and their disciples were all deeply rooted in the various superior elves. Attacking them would be no different from stepping on a hornet's nest. Well, if they were easy to deal with, Harloise would have done so long ago. Alright, I'll personally send them to the Inferno of Hades. That's my promise. Originally, I had promised to help Harloise take revenge only because the Elven Alliance wanted me to do so in exchange for benefit. I didn't really care about it. I would simply take care of any Harloise I met, and I wouldn't actively provoke them even if I didn't. But now that Harloise had resolved herself and made a concession under my persuasion, as a man, I would help her take her revenge. They were nothing more than a bunch of old bastards who betrayed their master. I would spend some effort and pay any price to kill them all within 3 years. Harloise actually flushed red, probably because she sensed that my promise was incredibly sincere. Tears flashed in her eyes. Was there some kind of misunderstanding? She wouldn't normally be moved, but she was moved to help her kill someone? But the next instant, she regained her calm and stopped looking at me. It seemed that she was rather shy. The redness on her pointy ears soon faded. Her beautiful eyes stared directly at the succubus Didina. Her expression kept changing as she opened and closed her mouth. She wanted to ask something, but was also afraid of learning the truth. The 3-god equipment was obviously the Elven royalty's greatest secret. Only a few people would know about it. Harloise had most likely already guessed who Didina was. At most, there would only be a few candidates. Mother? Didina smiled wryly and shook her head. She knew that she wouldn't be able to hide it anymore. Aunt Betta. This time, Didina fell silent. But in the end, she still shook her head. The next instant, Harloise covered her face and lowered her head. She didn't ask anything else, but her expression became even more complex as she looked at Didina. It would seem that there were only 3 people who knew about the 3-god equipment. After eliminating the 2 wrong answers, there was only one correct answer left, even if that answer was incredibly inconceivable. At this moment, I also covered my mouth. It wasn't that I learned anything from Harloise. She had already done her best to cut off any direct psychological connection between us. It was just that I was able to guess just what Didina was to Harloise from simple family ethics. I can't laugh. Laughing out loud will really kill me. Harloise will die together with me. I did my best to stifle my laughter as I racked my brain for what to say. After all, Didina really did count as Harloise Sr. Father, no, Mother, please marry your daughter to me. My astonishing words echoed in the living room. Everyone's gazes were focused on the person who was kneeling down and proposing. As the person involved, Dedina's expression was filled with shock and disbelief. "Ha ha, Harloise, you now have a void devourer younger sister. How does it feel to have a younger sister get married before you? Ha!" Finally, I couldn't take it anymore as I laughed so hard that I rolled around on the ground. The next instant, I also used my familiar cat-biting combo. Don't misunderstand, I wasn't the one proposing. The one kneeling on the ground was that legend-ranked Draken who had appeared out of nowhere. However, while he was proposing to Dedina, he was secretly glancing outside the door. There, a four-legged legend-ranked archer was looking at him with a complex expression. It was such a serious topic just now, but the moment it appeared, it became such a farce. This guy really knows how to forcefully steal the show. What's this? A four-legged void devourer with a giant mouth? Forget it, it's rare for me to be serious for 2 minutes. I shouldn't watch this bastard ruin my worldview. Chapter 623. The Light of Sinsar Dub, a wise schemer, the legendary elven Emperor Abolar VII. He had countless praises and accomplishments in history. During his reign, the Elven Empire had long since entered its final stages. In order to increase the Elven Empire's declining national power, Abolar broke all traditions and prohibitions. Not only did he allow outsiders and mixed-blood elves to enter the Elven Empire's upper echelons, he also greatly promoted the young talents of the wild elves and lower elves, unearthing the potential of the Elven Empire's lower echelons. This allowed the Elven Empire to flourish for more than 300 years. But he was already dead. The moment he died, the wild elves and lower elves who had tasted the sweetness of power rebelled against his daughter. In order to deal with the Elven Empire's increasingly unstable situation, Abolar used a series of schemes to create conflict between the superior elves. He promoted the wild elves and lower elves to keep the ever more arrogant moon elves and silver elves in check. This allowed the Central Elven Empire, which had already entered its final stages, to survive for several millennia. But he was already dead. The moment he died, the wild elves and lower elves who had tasted the sweetness of power rebelled against his daughter. In order to appease the superior elves, he reduced the authority of the royal family, and gave many important responsibilities that were originally in the hands of the royal elves to the superior elves. This bought over many large superior elf families, and also calmed the hearts of the people. But he died. After he died, those important responsibilities became the death knell of his daughter. From a certain standpoint, Abolar was indeed an expert at politics. At the very least, when he was alive, the entire Elven Empire's upper echelons maintained a subtle balance. But his death completely disrupted that subtle balance, and everything went out of control. If Abolar hadn't died, perhaps the Elven Empire would have had some time to reorganize and introduce outsiders and mixed-blood elves into the Elven Empire. But in history there were no ifs. Was the leader of the reform wise and kind? Was the reform just a hair's breadth away from success? In the end, looking at the result, it was no different from a foolish and incapable ruler who completely ruined the Elven Empire. I actually felt a bit of heartache for Harloise, who had succeeded Abolar. Her father's overly high evaluation of history caused her, a princess of a fallen Elven Empire, to have quite a bit of a bad reputation. Foolish and short-sighted for not continuing with Abolar's policies? The superior elf lords who were her uncles and grandfathers tried to force her to abdicate the throne. How could a little princess who was still underage possibly resist? In the end, she could only cancel the previous emperor's policy. The result was that she ended up offending the new half-blood elves and low-level elves. Unable to maintain balance among the superior elves? All the accumulated grudges from the previous generation erupted. How could the moon elves suppress this? Anslo just happened to have successfully ascended to become a main god at that time, and the moon elves already had the most foundational divine authority. How could the moon elves possibly balance the situation? Did you not see the ambitions of those traitors? They were all old ministers who had been promoted by the previous generation. This was the period when the royal power was weak. Without a strong enough reason, how could they take down these old fellows? Lack of political and diplomatic skills? A little girl who was still playing with dolls a few years ago, it was inconceivable to expect her to become a 1,000-year-old sly fox. But again, there are no ifs in history, and no one will look at the process. The final result was the destruction of the country. But I have to say that this was 90% because of her father, who was too good at causing trouble. He took too many advantages and accumulated a lot of resentment, but he didn't clean up the mess. In the end, he died prematurely without any preparations, and the backlash caused his descendants to suffer. Of course, I wouldn't say such things out loud. That was because I knew that Harloise had always viewed her wise father as her idol. She believed that she had betrayed the Gold Elves' inheritance and glory. If I spoke up for her, she would likely resent me. I wouldn't be so foolish as to say such unflattering things. That was because I knew how much Harloise worshipped her father. I wanted to laugh even more as I watched Didina and Harloise stare at each other. Abolar VII had first lost a war against the Gold Elf. Then, he was pursued and assassinated, and he died on his bed in the royal palace. What was certain was that he had truly died. This was the last phase of the Gold Elf Empire. The Gold Elves' true gods had been replaced by the superior elf gods. Abolar, who would have been 100% certain to enter the Gold Elf main god's divine kingdom, fell into the river Styx and was reincarnated as a demon. This was completely different from Eliza, who had directly transformed into a demon. Directly transforming into a demon from the river Styx would be equivalent to reincarnation. As mentioned many times in the past, undead would be transformed into demons from the river Styx. Everything would have to start from the beginning. The lowest level demons would have to experience the primitive law of the jungle. Any demon that could evolve into a demon would have to have devoured at least 100 of their own kind. An existence that slowly became a high-level demon would be able to awaken their memories from their previous life. But at that time, an undead's personality would have already been set through endless slaughter. They wouldn't care too much about their previous life's events. They would only treat their memories and knowledge as accumulations. Normally speaking, it would take several decades for a demon to recover their memories from their previous life. At that time, it would take several centuries or even several millennia for a demon to recover their memories from their previous life. By then, most of their family members would have already died. It would be difficult for a demon to return to the mortal plane. Several hundred years of a demon's life would have already passed. Who would care about a few decades? Demons wouldn't care about the past either. However, Abolar just happened to be an elf. Didina wasn't Abolar. She wasn't an elf, but rather a succubus. However, she had Abolar's knowledge and memories. At the very least, she could be considered a reincarnation. Harloise probably had rather complex emotions as she looked at her father. What, Didina the Lucky? Didina's magical knowledge from the Gold Elves and accumulations from her previous life alone means that Didina's power level is definitely quite high. But of course, void devourers aren't any kind creatures. Without enough power to tame them, they would have long since been devoured. Harloise and Didina were still staring at each other, but I took the lead and considerately walked out of the treasury, giving them some time and space to talk to their family. Beifong, come with me. Beifong had always been a smart person. Seeing that the situation wasn't right and that it wasn't the time for a marriage proposal, he directly followed me out. Why did you come to the Chaos Abyss? I'm here for a vacation. I want to see the scenery and people of various places. I want to experience the famous wild style of the Chaos Abyss. Beifong looked up at the sky with an expression of anticipation, fatigue, and excitement. He really seemed like a tourist, wild style? More like a wild beast horde. Beifong wasn't lying, but he wasn't completely telling the truth either. You probably don't know that you're on the headlines right now. All the crimes you've committed have been exposed. Even I'm tempted by the bounty on you right now. I thought about it for a moment and finally gave up on the idea of exchanging for the bounty. Besides, now wasn't the time to get to the bottom of things. If I really wanted to do something to the elves, every day was important. I would probably have to return to the mortal plane first. However, there were some things that I still hadn't finished yet. Perhaps I could ask this Calamity Beifong, who was ranked 3rd on the Calamity rankings, to help me out. Have you heard of Sun God Aloyo? He lives on the 372nd level of the Chaos Abyss. It's said that he's a super handsome man. Beifong yawned as if he was bored. He's a mystical creature with an eagle's head and a human body. He's an ancient species, and there should only be one of him in the entire world. You want me to kidnap him? Although I haven't done illegal things for many years, since you're requesting it, and since it's for the sake of justice, I'll make an exception this time. Let's kill him. Beifong instantly had a serious expression. However, his murky yellow eyes were filled with excitement and passion. I didn't even have the energy to comment on this. I could only pray for Aloyo in my heart. He's a former main god, while Beifong is only a new semi-god. There shouldn't be any major problems. Forget it, I'm not going to pursue this any further. It's fine as long as the result is good. Even though there was a tremendous difference in power level between Beifong and Aloyo, nobody seemed to think that Beifong would be killed by Aloyo. I took out a pen and paper and carefully wrote down my requirements for myth-ranked materials. I then handed it to the excited Draken. As long as you help me complete this task, I'll try to convince Didina to help you with your marriage with the Void Devourer. No, I'll personally obtain Didina's mother's approval. This is my promise to Tina. Tina? Oh, that was the Void Devourer's name. Fine, do whatever you want. I waved my hand weakly. I always felt a mysterious sense of helplessness whenever someone before me was involved. I felt like I would lose if I took things too seriously, and that I would become an idiot if I got angry. Right, why don't you have a chat with Cassio first? After all, you're sworn brothers. This is my responsibility. I'll take it seriously. Beifong nodded with a serious expression. He then walked towards Cassio. His fearless back made me mysteriously think of a brave warrior who was about to be executed. He didn't seem like a pervert at all. You're here? I'm here. You shouldn't have come. But I'm still here. It's all your fault. Cassio seemed to have lost control of his emotions. Yes, it's all my fault. But those are my true feelings. I don't regret saying them. Friendship and familial love will eventually change. This is the choice of fate. This is what I feel from the bottom of my heart. Beifong had a pained expression. His eyes were filled with sorrow from being hurt by love. He seemed quite sincere, but why did his lines sound so familiar? Tonight's 8:00 slot. Oh, thank you. I watched as the two men, a centaur and a draken, listened to Beifong's incredibly mushy lines. They even seemed to be hugging each other and crying. I was finally unable to endure the churning in my stomach, so I retreated first. Oh, wait, I want to watch a four-way romance. Four-way? Tina, Beifong, Cassio, and Aloyo in 2 days. This is a classic combination of 3 men and 1 woman. A romance film with 3 men and 1 woman? That sounds like a normal 8:00 slot, but if the core of the film is a succubus, it'll be a heavy taste for women. If the core is a male, it'll be a heavy taste for women. If it's Beifong, it'll be a heavy taste for animals. In order to avoid being poisoned by the voices behind me, I found a corner and hid there. However, less than 5 minutes later, the door to my room opened. Harloise and Didina walked out. Harloise had a serious expression, as if she had resolved herself. Chapter 6:24. The Moonwheel Capital, the capital of the Saint Heen Empire, was the birthplace of Elven Empress Aphina I. The elves had chosen this place as a place of revival that gave them hope. Naturally, this place had many natural advantages. The Moonwheel capital was located in the core area of the magical Fallen Star Forest. Plus, the Moonwheel capital had been here for many years, and it already had a large number of mana pools and magic trap. Since the elves were the children of nature, the forest had a special meaning to them. The dense forest would forever be the elves' strongest ally. The elves' subordinates, the centaurs, forest dwarves, and other natural creatures all lived here. Also, the incredibly rare moon elves lived in the Fallen Star Forest. The moon elves were elves, but they also weren't elves. Only the elves' strongest warriors and mages would be able to leave their souls behind in this forest when their lifespans were about to come to an end. The Fallen Star Forest was a special realm to begin with. Pure souls would be enveloped by starlight here, transforming into shining, undying warriors. Alright then, according to undead mages, this was a type of undead creature. However, the elves believed that this was another form of existence from their ancestor, the Valkyrie. If you asked me, wasn't the Valkyrie still an undead creature? They would often suddenly appear at night and patrol the forest borders, punishing poachers and invaders. They would transform into starlight again under the moonlight, and would have astonishing power in the forest. And this was only the Fallen Star Forest's regular defense force. In the past, the Sun and Moonwheel capital's defenses would be carried out in silence in the forest. But now, the silence here had long since been broken. Busy scenes could be seen everywhere. The forest that used to only be able to taste the moonlight and the chirping of insects at night had awakened. White-robed priests and druids were everywhere under the protection of guards. Under the hostile gazes of the moon elves, they chose towering trees that had a long history. Ancient oaths and poems were repeated. In a mystical white light, the earth shook and countless pieces of mud and stone were transformed into dust. The treants stood up, their roots transforming into giant feet, and their treetops transforming into heads. Ancient war trees that could move and fight could be seen everywhere in the forest. The entire forest seemed to come to life. The towering treants all stood up. They didn't need anyone to command them as they slowly advanced with heavy footsteps. However, their footsteps were heavy and ancient, and their sighs were filled with sorrow. Even if they survive the calamity, the Fallen Star Forest will be finished. The young white-robed Drool Sar looked at the powerful giants. Their footsteps were enough to create an earthquake, but he himself was shedding tears. A treant that could transform into an ancient war tree meant that it had evolved from a plant to an intelligent being. Even with Drool's guidance, it was still an ancient tree that had endured for thousands of years. Even though the Fallen Star Forest could be traced back to the Elven Empire's era, there was still a limit to the number of such ancient trees that had been lost in battle. And now, Drool and the Nature Priest had summoned an army of almost 10,000 treants. In that case, let alone 100-year-old trees, even trees that were only a few decades old would be used. Not only would the summoned treants have low intelligence, it would also be impossible for them to become complete treants. Without the support of the earth, the treants' lifespans would soon come to an end. Such a loss would be impossible to make up for. Large swathes of the forest were withering and dying. Using the power of nature to forcefully raise ancient war trees was an obvious violation of all the teachings of nature. This was also forcing this ancient forest to enter an early Armageddon. Many Drool and Nature Priests were shedding tears. It was likely that even if they survived this calamity, they would never be able to rest easy in their next lives. It was inevitable that their power levels would decrease, and it was possible that they would commit suicide on a large scale. Fortunately, this was the Moon Elves' forest. If this had been a forest created by the Wood Elves, it was likely that the Wood Elves would rather have their entire species perish than force the forest to perish. But looking at it from a different perspective, if this was truly the Wood Elves' forest, there would be far more ancient trees and nature creatures. The Wood Elves' fear of death would cause the forest to proactively fight for them, and there would be no need to forcefully raise ancient war trees. Treants and ancient war trees were incredibly important among the elves' large-scale combat unit. The elves were rich in mages and archers. However, even the famous Silver Moon Rangers among the elves were more proficient in combat based on agility. They would be at a disadvantage if they tried to block the enemy's powerful units head-on. The elves lacked meat shields or perhaps powerful cannon fodder. This was a glaring weakness of the elves since ancient times. This weakness wouldn't be obvious in small-scale battles, but it was constantly exposed on a major battlefield. No matter if it was the humans' incredibly powerful cavalry charge or the Beastman Berserker's bloody chaotic battles, the elves' battle formations would always be mysteriously broken through countless times. In the end, the elves would lose the battle and only be able to remain depressed. The warriors in the front row had all fallen. No matter how strong the archers and mages in the back row were, they were just waiting to be harvested. The elves were used to using summoned creatures, vassal species, and treants as meat shields. However, these cannon fodder's combat strength and fighting spirit were truly worrisome. The only reliable treants and ancient war trees required a large amount of resources and time to nurture. Not only would any of them die, they also had the fatal weakness of incredibly slow movement speed. In the past battles, many of the elves' enemies would either change the battlefield or go around the treant's line of defense, easily ignoring the powerful defense of the ancient war treants. However, this time, the ancient war treants might be able to play a big role in a defensive and positional battle. However, the Moon Elves' forceful activation of the ancient war trees was the equivalent of severing their combat potential for the next several hundred years. Of course, if the Moon Elves didn't go all out, it was likely that they would have no future. It was also worth mentioning that due to the Moon Elves' usual way of doing things, they didn't value other species at all in their territory. Even the Moon Elves' traditional vassal species didn't have many forest dwarves living in the forest. There were even fewer centaurs capable of melee and ranged combat. In the end, the Moon Elves could only rely on themselves. If it weren't for the fact that they were in dire straits, the Moon Elves wouldn't have committed such a crime that would definitely offend all Drool and the Wood Elves. Suddenly, a mountain wall started trembling as gray dirt fell down like rain. The next instant, that pitch-black mountain wall actually transformed into a black treant covered in dirt. This treant was several hundred meters tall. The moment it appeared and activated its domain, the entire sky was covered in dark clouds as a rainstorm began. Countless raindrops nourished his withered tree trunk, washing away the mud on his body. Dark green sprouts grew at a speed visible to the naked eye. His closed eyes opened, but they were filled with a sorrowful silver light. Wall of Despair? Didn't he receive a fatal injury in the Yongye War more than 100 years ago? Dragonsteel Guardian and Aina's Anchor? Why have they all awakened? Do they not intend to live any more? As the elder treant let out a sorrowful cry, all the legendary treants woke up from their long slumber to welcome their fates and their end. Drool Sar couldn't believe his eyes as he looked at this scene. These weren't treants that had been forcefully awakened. These were treants that had been severely injured in the previous battle. Not even the most outstanding nature priest would be able to heal their injuries. They could only extend their lives through long slumber and wait for a miracle to arrive. But now all of them were awakened. It was likely that they realized that a miracle hadn't arrived yet, and that the final moment had arrived. The Starfall Forest is completely finished. Several hundred Drool Sar and priestesses surrounded the treants. Green and white light that represented healing kept flashing on the treants' bodies. However, this would only be able to temporarily extend the treants' lives. No. The elders won't be able to stay active for much longer. Could it be that the demon wave is about to arrive? Drool Sar looked up at the sky in disbelief. The darkness of midnight had been shattered, and the moonlight that guided the Moon Elves forward had been blocked by dark clouds. Countless cracks had appeared in space, and these cracks were constantly spreading. The aura of chaos that brought destruction was already flowing out. A wild wolf came into contact with this aura, and its body distorted as it transformed into a filthy and warty berserk wolf. This berserk wolf directly pounced at its brethren. Even more aura of chaos descended as large numbers of wild beasts transformed into dangerous magical beasts of hell. The information is true. The holy war has begun. Chapter 6:25. Even though dawn was about to arrive, pitch-black clouds still covered the sky. It was as if misfortune was hanging over all the elves' hearts. Rangers' eagle vision and mages' long-range vision spells could see the cracks in the sky so clearly. The aura of chaos flowing out of the cracks caused everyone to instinctively feel nauseous and afraid. The moment the aura of the chaos abyss arrived in this world, it brought a great deal of trouble to the mortal plane's residents. Normally docile domestic pigs were being demonized, but they swiftly transformed into incredibly aggressive demonized wild boars. Large numbers of demonized wild beasts appeared in the suburbs. These wild beasts instinctively attacked living creatures before them, tearing them apart and devouring them, using a strange method to achieve self-evolution. By now, nobody doubted the prophecy of the demon wave's arrival anymore. The eternal sun and moon have been blocked by dark clouds. Countless cracks have appeared in the pitch-black sky. The aura of the wind spirits is filled with the smell of rot and sulfur. Even the clean water in our tanks has become rotten and dirty. Livestock are beginning to demonize. This is exactly the same as the omens of the demon wave recorded in the history book. Venerated Anslow, why do the elves have to suffer so much misfortune? Are we unable to escape from Armageddon? At this point, any lies that could reassure the elves would become meaningless. Even though the elves wouldn't admit that the prophecy was true, some elderly elves among the elves had been lucky enough to survive the previous holy war. They had managed to survive the chaos abyss to this day. How could they not remember the aura of the chaos abyss? These symptoms could all be summed up by the fact that there was a high concentration of chaos abyss pollution. And as the demon wave arrived, this world would soon become even more chaos abyss than the chaos abyss. Although the amount of chaos abyss aura that had accumulated this time couldn't compare to the local aura of the chaos abyss, the quality of the aura was far superior. In the past, existences from the chaos abyss would have to go through a filter net created by the power of order. This would take a lot of time and effort, and the final result would still be a projection. But the current holy war, perhaps it would be more accurate to call it a dimensional war. This was a direct connection between the two dimensions. Any dimension that came into contact with the chaos abyss would be corrupted and transformed into the chaos abyss. This was determined by the very nature of the chaos abyss. This was also the reason why the chaos abyss had gradually become the endless chaos abyss. Meanwhile, the mortal plane He represented the origin of order and chaos. It was the most important battlefield for the two major origin powers. Every time the chaos abyss connected with the mortal plane, not only would it be a disaster for the mortal plane, it would also be a disaster for the chaos abyss. The entire chaos abyss was like a bloodthirsty beast that had smelled its prey. It was squirming, roaring, and desperately absorbing the fragrance of the mortal plane. Under its control, a tremendous amount of chaos abyss aura accumulated in the mortal plane's entrance. In fact, the aura had already broken through the mortal plane's limits and reached the mortal plane on the other side. To abyssal creatures, abyssal aura was naturally a good thing. It was a reward from the will of the abyss, and after absorbing it, they would become even more powerful. However, an appropriate amount of hormone nourishment was nourishment and food. If it was too much to be absorbed, it would be poison. Currently, countless chaos abyss species, demons, and devils in the snowy forest area of the 7th level of the chaos abyss had been surrounded by abyssal aura. They were twisting and rolling on the ground in pain, but they were also laughing maniacally in delight as if they had gotten a great deal. Some small demons were unable to withstand the abyssal aura and directly changed their forms. Small demons that had originally been around 1 meter tall twisted and transformed into large demons that were over 3 meters tall. However, their bodies were torn apart and blood kept flowing out. Yet, they didn't feel any pain at all. Their eyes rolled back into their heads as they drooled and crawled on all fours like wild dogs, roaring in the direction of the unknown dimensional door. These were Chaos War slaves, failures that were unable to withstand the power of chaos. Once the dimensional door connecting the Chaos Abyss and the mortal plane opened, these Chaos War slaves would become the first wave of cannon fodder for the demon wave. Their overly strengthened physical bodies would be quite unstable. However, their abundant mana would allow them to detonate themselves at any moment. There was a tremendous number of these Chaos War slaves, and if they met any obstacles, they would use their very lives to destroy everything in front of them. Meanwhile, the victors who successfully ascended through the power of chaos wouldn't be able to leave this place so easily. They were bound by the will of the Chaos Abyss, and would also become the vanguard of the Chaos Abyss. The abyssal aura continuously strengthened them, but it also robbed them of their rationality and ability to think. The moment that the dimensional door to the Chaos Abyss opened, their intelligence would only be slightly higher than that of the Chaos War slave. However, unlike the defeated Chaos War slaves who were destined to become expendable in battle, as long as they were able to survive the first demon wave, it would be possible for them to regain their rationality. In fact, in all the previous holy wars, there were even many powerful demons that reached a bottleneck or were nearing the end of their lifespans. However, they had gambled with their lives on the line and finally succeeded in ascending to become Chaos Lord. The powerful demons that were doing quite well wouldn't approach the mortal plane during this period of time. That would be the equivalent of voluntarily choosing to become cannon fodder. As long as they were close enough, even Chaos Lords would be unable to resist the will of the Chaos Abyss's forceful recruitment. And even if these demons increased their power, it would be even more dangerous if their rationality was weakened. If they wanted to enter the mortal plane to enjoy slaughter and flesh, they could simply wait until the first demon wave ended. Of course, since there were rules, there would definitely be loopholes. Many demons were actively absorbing the aura of the Chaos Abyss in the 7th level snow forest region in order to increase their own power. Perhaps they wouldn't be able to absorb much of the aura of the Chaos Abyss, but it would be worth it if they could avoid getting involved in the first demon wave, which was the most dangerous. But even if they were only stealing some leftover resources, they would still have to constantly retreat, and they wouldn't be able to steal for long. That was because as time passed, the chaotic region of the Chaos Abyss would constantly expand. Soon, it would spread from the snow forest region to the entire 7th level of the Chaos Abyss. And this wasn't even the end. The nearby 6th and 8th levels would automatically connect with the 7th level, forming an entire dimension. This would become the first demon wave's soldier region. Later on, all life in these dimensions would become members of the first demon wave, and this entire dimension would be directly connected, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that it was directly connected to the mortal plane. When the Holy War ended, it would be impossible for anyone to return to the Chaos Abyss. The next step would only be activated when the will of the Chaos Abyss and its aura completely covered the entire dimension. At that time, not a single place in the entire Chaos Abyss would be safe. The Chaos Abyss was greedy. It wouldn't believe that this would be enough to invade the entire mortal plane. It would continuously connect with other Chaos Abyss dimensions and have them become new soldiers until the first demon wave ended. The number of levels in the Chaos Abyss was only a special concept in terms of space. The Chaos Abyss wouldn't only choose the nearest level. This was another type of lucky draw. Whichever dimension was chosen would be required to enter the Chaos Abyss. The victors and survivors would receive blessings from the Chaos Abyss, and perhaps the Chaos Abyss did indeed have its own will. Usually, the dimensions that were chosen would be large-scale dimensions with extremely high populations. and when the dimensional door to the mortal plane was opened, the ordinary citizens and imps there would all lose their reason and become cannon fodder. It would be impossible to calculate how many of them would become cannon fodder. This was also the foundational reason why the first demon wave would be nearly impossible to stop. No matter how powerful the country on the other side of the dimensional door was, the first demon wave would destroy that country. That was because the first demon wave would contain all the power of several Chaos Abyss dimensions before they were destroyed. The bloodthirsty residents of the Chaos Abyss would destroy everything in front of them like maniacs. Countless powerful empires in history had been destroyed by the first demon wave. Every single demon wave would be fatal. If the first demon wave was a berserk beast horde that relied purely on instinct to kill, then it would be easier to deal with. Forbidden spells and traps would be able to clear out a large number of cannon fodder. However, there was a black giant sitting cross-legged outside the dimensional door. His obsidian greatsword was still dripping with silver-white god's blood. He was the commander of the first demon wave, Donati's. The Chaos War God was the controller of the first demon wave. Nobody knew how he was able to do this, but he was indeed able to maintain his reason in the first demon wave. He was also able to calmly command the wave of destruction to destroy everything in front of him. In the past, the Chaos War God would always have a large group of Valkyrie guards around him. These guards would become frontline commanders under Donati's protection in the first demon wave, helping to take on the responsibility of commanding the first demon wave. Unfortunately, this time, Donati's would probably be a lone commander. An army with or without a basic commander would be completely different. From a certain standpoint, losing all of the Valkyrie guards in the Hades would indeed be a tremendous loss for the Chaos Abyss. In fact, it would be no less than losing a main god. Currently, the Chaos War God had his eyes closed. He appeared as if he were a gigantic bronze statue in hibernation. He seemed to be in a deep sleep. His breathing was as astonishing as thunder. However, none of the demons around him dared to approach him. Any existence with even the slightest bit of power would be able to sense that Donati's power level was slowly increasing within the aura of the Chaos Abyss. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that Donati's had recovered to his peak. In the world of high-level combat strength, everyone knew that the Donati's in the first demon wave was the true Chaos War God who could destroy everything. He would tear apart all obstacles, even if they were gods. Chapter 6:26. This situation doesn't seem right. Since I was intending to do something during the first demon wave, gathering information would naturally be my top priority. But when I put together all the information I had gathered, I discovered that the situation was far from good. Something was even more off. The Chaos Abyss had been far too thorough in their actions this time. For the will of the Chaos Abyss, whose ultimate goal was the evolution of species, pure destruction was only a method, not the ultimate goal. Many of its choices would be quite random. And this time, the will of the Chaos Abyss was showing its true evil intentions. The location of the Chaos Abyss's portal had been far too intentional. That was the elves' final shelter. Encountering the first demon wave, there would basically be a massacre. The location of the portal in the Chaos Abyss was also a major problem. It was located in the 7th level of the Chaos Abyss. Normally, this level wouldn't be a big deal, but if one considered the characteristics of the demon wave and the surrounding levels, it would be easy to see the obvious evil intentions of the Chaos Abyss. The 9th to 13th levels of the Chaos Abyss had originally been Demon Marquis Ladvioka's territory. That's right, the territory of the Lord of Putrefaction who had died in the Battle of the Hades. Ladvioka had died, but more than 20 powerful demons had claimed that they were his descendants and that their true bodies had returned. They were currently fighting over this Chaos Abyss Lord's inheritance. But now there was no need for them to fight. Based on the demon wave's abnormal downward trend, it was likely that the 9th to 13th levels wouldn't be able to escape. And it just so happened that these levels were in a bad situation. During the Battle of the Hades, the Lord of Putrefaction had shown us the frightening power of his hurting plane. His territory was filled with his creations and creatures from other planes. Although he had previously restricted their movements, these dangerous toys had all gone out of control after he died. Currently, these few levels of the Chaos Abyss were quite dangerous. Nobody knew if a seemingly inconspicuous kitten would suddenly transform into a tiger monster that was several hundred meters long. And it just so happened that Ladvioka liked to give dangerous creatures the appearance of being cute and harmless. A main god's former territory would definitely be far more dangerous than any ordinary Chaos Abyss. Not to mention, this was the territory of Ladvioka, an expert in raising dangerous creatures. For the elves, this was the worst possible choice. Alright, there was no need for everyone to play guessing games now. These creations would probably all be tossed into the mortal plane. Perhaps after a series of survival of the fittest, a few new stars from the Chaos Abyss would appear. However, this would be a nightmare for the elves. After sorting through all this information, even I felt powerless. The so-called strategic arrangement also depended on the strength and number of chess pieces on both sides. This was just like an old king and a warrior playing against the enemy's 10 sets of chess pieces. No matter how I looked at it, it would only result in death. Learn from the Chaos Abyss's operations. Do you really think you can win just by attacking the opponent? It's so realistic that I can't laugh at it. Competing against the Chaos Abyss in terms of combat potential and energy consumption would probably be the most foolish of actions. I didn't even need to give this information to the elves. The elves should have long since started collecting information. This desperate battle situation would probably force them to use up all their combat reserves, but it was likely that they wouldn't be able to last much longer. How much longer? That'll depend on the Chaos Abyss. But at most, it won't exceed 10 days. Harlois answered my question as she looked at the map. Ever since she met Didina, she had been maintaining her human form. She had also become much more serious, and she was even wearing clothes now. Why did this sound so strange? The current situation was quite obvious. The Chaos Abyss was filled with malice towards the elves and wanted to see them all die. As for the will of the Chaos Abyss, it should be your younger brother. Theoretically speaking, this is indeed a possibility. However, we all know that the guidance of fate is always so difficult to understand. Perhaps your guess is a part of fate itself. I was the one who taught you divination, and you've never even passed. Let's get straight to the point. I could only helplessly take a deep breath. Probably, maybe. Fine, he definitely did it. Did he have a grudge against the elves? Of course he did. One of the main culprits behind the Mist Kingdom's destruction was the elves. I had already taken revenge, but Didina hadn't. Didina's memory wasn't that bad. Only someone who controlled the will of the Chaos Abyss, or at least a portion of it, would be able to do such a thing? I could still remember the image of Didina dragging Cynthia into the void. No evidence? Didina had just beaten up Anslo just 2 days ago. Why else would he injure the main god of the elves? My family's misfortune. As I sighed insincerely, I was constantly trying to guess what Cavendish wanted to do. Perhaps revenge was his goal, but it definitely wouldn't be his ultimate goal. However, I had far too little information right now, so guessing would be meaningless. I should first think about what I needed to do. Did the Northlands send a reply? Yes, they'll do as you say. They should be able to make it in time. We agreed to board the airship in Sindel. They'll go pick up the Silver Elves first, which will be 2 days late. If they can arrive on time by the day after tomorrow, they'll probably arrive at the Moonwheel capital in 1 week. The Silver Elves heading to the Northlands were still quite far away from the Northlands. Renee's Borealis fleet was also on the way, so I decided to have her pick up the Silver Elves. Are you ready to establish the Northlands? Keep everything simple. We'll hold the coronation ceremony as soon as we arrive in Sindel. Diana, Victoria, Swanna, and Kelly are all on the way there. I nodded. It would seem that my plan was progressing quite smoothly. By the time we arrived in the small city of Sindel, all 4 superior elf species would be represented. This coronation ceremony wouldn't be too casual. Harloise, you're already prepared to become Elven Empress? Why are you so calm? Because it all happened so quickly, I'm a little numb to it. That's right, the coronation ceremony and the establishment of the Northland's Elven Empire. Although I was already intending to help the elves, how to help them was still a problem. Since the Northland's elves already had hopes of establishing their own Elven Empire, it wouldn't be impossible to establish an Elven Empire. This wouldn't be the first Elven Empire in the Mist Alliance. If we supported the Northland's elves as ordinary human allies, we would be nothing more than a guest army, that would be nothing more than cannon fodder. In that case, rather than inexplicably helping the elves for free, it would obviously be better to help the Elven branch, as the rightful ruler of the Elven Empire. Not only would this be more in line with righteousness, it would also be much more convenient in practical terms. From the information I had already obtained, it was obvious that directly fighting against the demon wave would be the equivalent of suicide. And if we wanted to organize a retreat, we would likely need to fight for the authority of leadership, which would result in a conflict with the ruler of Moonwheel City. At that time, Elven Empress Harloise would lead the 4 superior elves to suppress the false ruler. I was truly looking forward to it. Even if we were helping the Northlands in their hour of need, we would also be taking advantage of their misfortune. Our assistance wouldn't be for free. We would be using the rightful ruler of the elves in exchange. What? You don't recognize Empress Harloise and the Northland's Elven Empire? Fine, we'll immediately leave. At that time, either their species would be wiped out, or their country would be destroyed. I was truly looking forward to this scene. However, this was actually nothing more than a cover, because no matter which option they chose, I wouldn't give up on my authority. That was because I knew very well that compared to an undefeatable god, having a useless ally would be far more fatal. If that useless ally had the right to command you, it would be no different from suicide. Stop talking about your younger brother. You're just as petty. Aren't you looking forward to it? Of course Harloise was looking forward to it. She would be able to return to the elves as Empress Harloise, and she would also be able to punish the traitors as her ruler. This would make her so excited that she wouldn't be able to sleep at night. If this had been in the past, she wouldn't have even thought about it. But now that the 3 god equipment that symbolized royal authority had appeared, and the Northlands just happened to have gathered 4 superior elf leaders, Harloise truly felt like she was fated to return. I was even looking forward to seeing the superior elves' expressions when the fairies' intelligence organization announced Empress Harloise's return. It would definitely be quite complex. Everything that we were doing now actually had a high level of political meaning. When the Moon Elves had gone overboard, the Northland's Elven Empire and Empress Harloise hadn't just watched as the traitors were destroyed by the demon wave. Instead, they had even volunteered to help the Moon Elves. In that case, no matter what happened next, this meant that Empress Harloise had no intention of going after the Moon Elves. When considering the elves' terrible past, a magnanimous and powerful empress would be far more likely to be recognized by all the elves. Meanwhile, the Northland's elves, the Northland's Mist Alliance, and the Hades gods would all become Empress Harloise's support. This would be her true strength in fighting for royal authority. The result of this rescue operation would be her first accomplishment. How well she did would directly affect how stable her rightful crown would be. Don't underestimate this crown. Countless elves viewed it as the most supreme existence in their hearts. As long as Harloise obtained this crown, countless elven arcanists, druid, and rangers would voluntarily join her side. From a long-term perspective, no amount of royal authority could compare to this false reputation. In order to deal with the demon wave, the new Borealis had brought along the Mist Alliance's elite. The Northland's elves had also brought their strongest lineup. However, this still wouldn't be enough. In order to fight against the demon wave, which was capable of destroying everything in its path, it would be the stupidest and most suicidal attempt. Even if one could fight against the demon wave for a single day and kill 10,000 demons, would one be able to fight against the entire holy war and kill off all the demons in the chaos abyss? It would be impossible to calculate how long the demon wave would last. That was because every time the demon wave descended, the demon wave would be reduced to rubble. Only chaos demons would remain there. I felt that as long as the will of the chaos abyss commanded the demon wave, there would likely be an endless amount of cannon fodder. In the end, the demon wave's main goal would be to migrate and retreat. 4 mega empires are working together. The other countries will probably give us some phase. I hope so. Not only was Harlois uncertain, there were some things that even I wasn't sure about. The Mist Alliance, Bardi Empire, Ottoman Empire, and Mage Country had all sent a joint request for the elves' human neighbors to open up their borders for refugees to pass through. However, there had been no response yet. If this was a time of peace, a joint request from these 4 major empires would definitely be quite powerful. But now that the demon wave was about to arrive, if all the elves ran away, wouldn't the human neighbors be the ones to take the brunt of the disaster? Open up their borders? Would the demon wave be far behind if the refugees arrived? Using the elves to exhaust the demon wave as much as possible would be the most beneficial choice for the humans. Since the destruction of a country was imminent, what would the other major empires' casual diplomatic requests count for? If it weren't for the fact that they were giving me and the Mist Alliance face, the 3 major empires wouldn't have sent such a request. That was why I didn't wait too long. I was also preparing my other backup plans. I hope that we can make it in time. I'm afraid that it'll be quite difficult. Honestly, I'm so sorry. Marguerite seemed rather embarrassed as she said this. As for the reason, I also think that it'll be quite difficult. It's best that we don't be overly optimistic, Adam added as he took big bites of his rice ball. No matter how I looked at him, he seemed just like a traveling backpacker. You still have the cheek to say such a thing. Didn't you say that you knew the way? I felt that I was incredibly foolish to have allowed a bastard like Adam to lead the way. Where are we now? Did we take the wrong teleportation portal? Which level of the chaos abyss was this barren desert? I looked up at the 3 moons above me and speechlessly asked the heavens, just where exactly was this place? We're lost at such a time? Does the heavens want the moon elves to die? No matter how I look at it, this seems like a man-made disaster. Did you really not intentionally allow him to lead the way? Didina, who had followed me here, was already showing me her evil intentions. Harlois was viciously glaring at me as if she was grinding her teeth. If it wasn't for the fact that she cared about her image, she would have likely bitten me already. I wanted to cry, but no tears would come out. Since I had already confirmed the plan, what was the point of me making a fuss? I really hadn't intended on scamming anyone this time. It was just that Adam was far too confident in his ability to say that he knew the shortcut. Forget it, I'll lead the way. Our Chaos Abyss guide was finally useful. Chapter 6:27. The 8th year of the FT Dawn era would be recorded as the year of bloodshed. That was because this was the year that the final holy war began. The following days were destined to be filled with rivers of blood. Currently, I was in an excellent mood as I looked at the bright sunlight. With Didina's guidance, we finally arrived at the rendezvous location. Of course, this wasn't the reason why I was in such a good mood. You must be in a good mood to be able to get rid of Eliza, right? Nonsense, I'm actually quite sad. Saying that while smiling isn't convincing at all. I need to tell her. Harlois, it's great that Father is here, isn't it? How much money will the fairies pay for this explosive information? After a short period of silence, we came to an agreement. The silly cat and I understood each other. Why do people have to hurt each other? The world must be filled with love. We nodded and came to an agreement, and everything was gone with the wind. Fine then, to be more reasonable, it would be better if we didn't all die together. That's right, Eliza had already helplessly left the team. We were using a teleportation portal to the mortal plane. As a demon lord, it would be impossible for her to leave, so she could only temporarily stay in the chaos abyss. Regrettably, but happily, this was indeed only temporary. When the demon wave arrived, the mortal plane would be directly connected to the chaos abyss. Even Donati's would be able to jump out from the chaos abyss, let alone Eliza. I also casually gave Eliza some missions to make things difficult for our enemies. However, what was surprising was that Didina, who was also a demon lord, was actually able to easily teleport through the dimensional door. It was as if she didn't care about the dimensional laws at all. Don't be so surprised. Succubi don't have much strength. I'm probably weaker than even a myth-superior elf, nor am I some demon noble. Why would she stop me? Actually, I wasn't the only one who was surprised. Adam, Marguerite, and even Harloise herself were all looking at Didina in astonishment. According to their estimations, since Didina was the immemorial elf emperor, just her inherited memories and knowledge, along with the passage of so many years, should have been more than enough for her to reach the peak of power. He is him, and I am me. Everyone chooses a different way of life. I think it's good now. At least the legendary demons I heard about have fallen, and I don't have to fight. I'm still alive. The reincarnation of a hero might not necessarily be a hero. The reincarnation of a wise and far-sighted saint might also be a butcher. The reincarnation of the reincarnation and reincarnation were two completely different individuals. Logically speaking, this was correct, but I still felt that something was off. Since he was living in the chaos abyss, he should have understood the law of the jungle. Succubi were treasures to other species, but to the powerful demons who thought with their muscles, succubi were useless subordinates. Living under someone else's roof and borrowing someone else's power wouldn't be a long-term solution. Who knew when you would meet an idiot who would kill you in order to become famous? Didina didn't seem like such an idiot. Moreover, as long as she absorbed the magic knowledge in her memories, she would be able to become a powerhouse. Her identity as a succubus would not restrict her from practicing magic. I looked over at her, but Harloise shook her head. It wasn't that she didn't know, but rather that she knew what was going on and didn't want me to continue asking. I could only helplessly shrug my shoulders as I inwardly sighed. Ever since Harloise met Didina, she had stopped using her cat form, and if she truly became the Empress, it was likely that her cat form would no longer exist. That won't happen. Even you're capable of leaving everything to me. I can do the same. That might not necessarily be the case. I don't have any official status right now. How could the Empress of a country leave just like that? TSK, what Empress? There's only one gold elf left, and all the superior elves are below me. No matter what I do, I'll still be the symbolic elven Empress. Even if I'm not a puppet, I'll still be nothing more than a flower vase. How boring. I can just leave a clone in the royal palace. Don't even think about getting rid of me. The silly cat suddenly leaned over to me. She was currently 2 heads taller than me, and her exquisite golden crown gave off an air of nobility. Her dress was extravagant, and her golden proportions made her look very feminine. Her blonde hair even had the fragrance of laurel. Cough, Harloise, could you tell me about the latest situation with the elves? I'd like to know which elders are still alive. Perhaps they'll be able to help. Harloise instantly had a bitter expression. How dare you tell your father that the gold elves were already finished? You were such an unfilial child. You deserved it. You deserve to be single for the rest of your life. Little Red's retorts were always so difficult to understand. Right now, she had transformed back into her little red dragon form. However, compared to her previous 1-meter-long infant dragon form, She was now roughly 3 meters long. Little Red had actually gained the most from this short trip to the Chaos Abyss. At her level, it would be incredibly difficult to improve any further. Although Little Red's power level seemed to have regressed for a short period of time, this was basically a change in her species' bloodline. This would greatly increase the upper limits of her combat strength. This was something that would be incredibly difficult to improve no matter how much she cultivated. In a way, this was the same as me changing my bloodline. It was just that Little Red's growth speed was much faster. I had originally come to the Chaos Abyss in search of power. Although my power level had greatly improved, I hadn't made any progress on the 4 most important magic swords apart from accumulating a bunch of fate points. Tisk, even if I have fate points, I can't exchange them for blueprints and materials. System, you're so useless. System, the God of Order's abilities were limited. All she could exchange for were equivalent items through karma, items that already existed. For me, who was already forging a new path, her fate points would be of limited help. The Holy War was about to begin. The 4 magic swords were only half complete, and I was still far from reaching semi-god rank. Although I acted like I didn't care, I was actually quite anxious. Semi-god rank wouldn't only increase my power level. If I reached semi-god rank in the upcoming demon wave, I would be able to use a mega-powerful trump card. This would be a foundational change. If I just smoothly created a myth-ranked weapon and forcefully reached semi-god rank, not only would there be endless problems, I would also be quite unwilling to accept it. It's not wrong to say that you're always making mistakes in the dark. Death and ice are both the power of chaos. There's an old veteran demon in the Chaos Abyss, the Elven Empress, who's the rightful successor of the Chaos Elven Empire. She's the one who taught elemental magic to the humans. Why don't you ask her instead of me? Indeed, Harloise hadn't even reached adulthood when she died. It was only after she was revived that she began to work hard at learning magic and mastering her own power. Logically speaking, she was no match for her ancestors, but for some reason, ever since I learned of Harloi's true identity, I felt rather awkward when looking at Didina. Besides, since you've already asked that bastard to help you ask Aloyo for something, just relax and wait. I'm quite confident in him. I was quite confident in him as well, but I was even more confident that he would go overboard. He wouldn't be Beifong if he didn't end up doing something intolerable in the end. Don't even mention it. The sacred lake where the elves were born is still being polluted. I don't even dare to admit that I know him. Otherwise, all the elves will fight me to the death. Lake Ardell was a holy land controlled by the Silver Elf. Legend had it that the Mother Goddess had created the first elves, but now, a certain beast king was causing trouble in the lake, polluting the water and affecting countless divine beasts. This was the foundational reason why Beifong was no longer able to stay in the mortal plane. Currently, the Moonwheel Capital's High Priestess Cecilia was having a similar problem. She hated that legendary beast king to the bone. Damned bastard, how am I supposed to explain this to the others? Cecilia was currently riding on a unicorn. Her holy priestess attire was eye-catching. She was also in the prime of her youth, but she had an expression filled with shame. As more and more aura of the Chaos Abyss leaked out from the dimensional cracks, the Moonwheel Capital's citizens became more and more panicked. But today they finally received some reassurance. The Silver Elves' reinforcements had arrived. Not only did they bring large numbers of elite Silver Elf Knight and Air Knight, they also brought large numbers of nature divine beasts. These were all the elven gods' favored children. They were truly powerful combat strength. Deer, elephant, bear, and so on. These nature divine beasts usually had the appearance of natural beasts, but they were even more holy and beautiful. They also possessed powerful strength bestowed by the heavens. In the past, only the most devout elves would be allowed to enter the sacred lake to receive divine blessings. Only then would they be able to see these holy and beautiful nature divine beasts. Now that they saw these nature divine beasts in their own city, The elves were naturally overjoyed and their morale was greatly boosted. Everywhere these nature-divine beasts passed by, lush green grass would appear like a carpet. No matter what season it was, flowers would naturally bloom. The beautiful nature-divine beasts gave off a natural glow. Just seeing them would make people feel reassured. However, Mommy, why are those nature-divine beasts' bellies so big? Are they going to give birth to little beasts? I can go see. Before a young elf could finish speaking, his frightened mother covered his mouth. This was a fact that everyone pretended not to see. How could he say it out loud? Plop. A certain high priestess with good hearing fell off her horse onto a unicorn. Chapter 628. The 8th year of the Dawn Era was destined to be difficult. Astonishing news kept appearing one after another. However, the most popular news right before the demon wave arrived was rather surprising. The wood spirits have begun selling new products, dusk fruits and dawn fruits. Each fruit costs 500 justice points, and each fruit is worth 5 years of life. Each person can only exchange for 5 fruits at most. From a certain standpoint, it was no wonder that this advertisement stole the headlines. When time became a commodity, it would truly be a priceless treasure. There had always been legends about treasures of time like the spring of youth, elven tears, and so on. I had even seen the real thing before. However, mass-producing treasures of time was something that was rather incomprehensible. The advertisement also explained the restrictions. The dusk fruits could be eaten as many times as one wanted, and it would be fine even if one ate them until the end of one's lifespan. However, the dawn fruits could only be eaten at most 5 times. Otherwise, one's physical body would collapse, and it was highly likely that one would suddenly die. Still, this was more than enough to make all the rulers go crazy. 5 fruits of life that were worth 5 years each meant that one's lifespan would be extended by 25 years. This was at least 1/3 of an ordinary person's lifespan. For a ruler, this was an extension of the peak of their lifespan. It would also be an opportunity for them to receive supreme glory and be evaluated in history, the right to lead a country during the Holy War. With the current exchange rate, 500 justice points was roughly equivalent to the price of killing 5 legend-ranked demons. An adventuring team with an average gold rank would be able to obtain 500 justice points after working hard on several major battlefields for a year. Compared to the lifespan that could be obtained, it actually wasn't that expensive. In fact, it was ridiculously cheap. For a time, the exchange rate between justice points and ordinary gold coins reached an all-time high. 500 justice points would be enough to exchange for a noble title in a small or medium-sized kingdom. Even so, justice points were still priceless. I had just arrived at the meeting place, but when I saw this piece of news, I actually laughed out loud. "You've finally succeeded? What a timely reign." As previously mentioned, the Wood Spirits' Forest of Dreams was a land of dreams that granted them the authority to create. However, the Wood Spirits' creations were limited to fruits and plants, and they could only provide buffs or debuffs to the creatures that consumed them. Previously, the Wood Spirits' most popular and expensive product was their fruits that permanently increased basic stat. Due to certain reasons, I had long since asked Amelia to research fruits that could change a species' age. Amelia also provided me with the theory of cell division, the relationship between lifespan, hormones, and the pituitary gland, and many other unproven theories. Anyways, in her forest of dreams, thoughts could change reality. As long as these unproven theories were self-justifying, it was possible that they could become research theories. Although it sounded ridiculous, this was indeed the research method of many idealistic mages. They were quite skilled at creating something out of nothing. However, the end product of this fruit definitely wouldn't be the same as the advertisement. I had seen far too many treasures that could forcefully extend one's lifespan, and none of them would cause one's physical body to collapse. However, it was true that no ordinary person with a short lifespan had ever obtained immortality. That was because the aging of one's spirit was far more hopeless than the aging of one's physical body. If one's spirit became too old, their soul and physical body would begin rejecting each other. In the end, their physical body and soul would become separated, and they would either become immobile zombies or living ghosts that could leave their bodies at any moment. In fairy tales, even those emperors that went through so much trouble to find the elixir of immortality had never had good endings. That was why the advertisement of only being able to extend one's lifespan by 25 years wasn't a complete lie. 20 years was a generation. For the first 20 years of one's lifespan, one's values and basic knowledge would be set. Their soul would also be in a stable state. If one continued to progress further, it was likely that all sorts of problems would occur. Actually, forcefully extending one's lifespan by 20 years was something that even great drool, great alchemists, and great priests could do. Quite a few people had done so, but those who went too far suffered retribution. Of course, even the most troublesome problem of extending one's physical body's lifespan could be solved as long as one didn't care about the price. The simplest solution would be to have the kings cultivate martial arts and magic to a certain level, so that their soul and physical body would have a high and stable connection. That would naturally solve the problem. However, when considering that making everyone undying would mean breaking the cycle of reincarnation, even if there wouldn't be any additional problems, it would mean that the balance of resources in the world of He would be broken. Not a single wise person would do such a thing. A dusk fruit that can increase one's age? Your illness can be cured? Harlow's smile was filled with evil intent. She even glanced down at my lower body as she spoke. Damn, what was the meaning of this? Damn, this wasn't developed for me, so I don't care at all. It's true. Hey, why are all of you looking at me like that? I really didn't develop this for myself. Everyone's sympathetic gazes made me furious. This time, I had truly been wrongly accused. All right, everyone knows that you only developed this for the sake of growing taller. I could only helplessly ask the heavens. I hadn't developed this for the sake of growing taller. The time bracelet was far more useful than any kind of shoes. Tui, I wasn't wearing any shoes to increase my height. I didn't need them at all. Forget it, I'll just tell you directly. This is for the Dawn children. Perhaps it's a bit like pulling up a seedling to help it grow, but it's far more useful than letting the seedling rot in the bone. Many of the Valkyrie reincarnations who were born with knowledge had already displayed their talents and obtained the glorious title of Dawn children. However, a child who was no more than 7 years old would always have a natural shortcoming. Even if the child's knowledge could keep up, the child's courage wouldn't be able to keep up. Even if the child's personality could keep up, the child's appearance wouldn't be able to convince everyone. The dawn fruit and dusk fruit that I had developed this time were all prepared for the Dawn children. In my opinion, rather than having the Dawn children powerlessly spend their childhood, considering the current situation in the mortal plane, it was likely that their childhood would be filled with bloodshed. It would be better to have the Dawn children be able to control their own fate. The Dawn fruit was nothing more than an extra to attract attention. Although items that could extend one's lifespan were precious, they could still be found on the market every few years. However, there had never been any items that could increase one's age. Nobody would want to die early. However, the Dawn fruit was a necessity in my original plan. The human Dawn children would be able to use the Dawn fruit after a few years of hard work. Elves, dwarves, dragons. Would you expect a young elf child to use a sword dance? Would you expect a young dragon that was no larger than a puppy to cast a forbidden spell? I had previously considered undead magic's curse of aging, but I later discovered that curse of aging used negative energy to forcefully age the physical body. This would permanently damage both the physical body and the soul. Logically speaking, all undead magic would be out of the question. In the future, I would still need to look for the nature faction. I didn't really have many choices in the nature faction, So I finally left this matter to Amelia's 7 virtues. The last time I met her, I even asked her about it, but she didn't have any information. It seemed that she had just recently made a breakthrough in this technology. Roland only found out much later that Amelia had only thought of this because of his reminder, and then successfully developed the dawn fruit. Right, lend me some of your justice points. I'm going to get some fruits. Little Red wasn't the one who spoke to me. She had a delighted expression as if she couldn't wait any longer. I suddenly felt like the heavens were rather unfair. Why was it that every time I plotted something, Little Red would always be the one to benefit? But then, she had a bitter expression. Although justice points couldn't be used to exchange, she could exchange them for items that others could use. Unfortunately, she had just learned that we didn't have any justice points left at all. You've all exchanged books. This was Marguerite. The gods' library had attracted countless mages. That was a true bottomless pit. The ancient secrets of magic had drained even the scholars' wallets dry. I've eaten, drunk, and played. I still have 7 justice points here. Which one of you wants? We ignored Adam's words. Not a single one of us had any hopes for him. This wasn't only because of his personality of casually spending money. The more direct reason was that Marguerite would probably clean out his wallet the moment it was full. Little Red herself didn't know what to say either. She didn't even go out to kill monsters to save up justice points. How could a proud dragon go out to work? Finally, Little Red's gaze landed on me. Considering how often I met enemies and how much I had accumulated in the past, it was highly likely that I still had justice points on me. I proudly raised my head and smiled. I do indeed have more than 2,000 justice points, but I'm going to buy some height shoes. I don't even have enough for myself. I then laughed out loud in delight. Who asked you to laugh at me? Little Red, did you really think that I'd forgotten how you laughed at me back in the day? I hadn't laughed enough yet, so don't even think about returning to normal. The evil dragon bared her teeth and spat out flames from her throat. She seemed to be threatening me, as if she was considering robbing me. However, I fearlessly used my trump card. Besides, one fruit takes 5 years to mature. Dragons take much longer to mature than 200-year-old elves. The stronger a dragon is, the slower they mature. If I did some quick calculations, you probably wouldn't be able to afford it even if I sold you. You'd be better off eating more justice points and growing faster. Alright then, a system notification appeared. Little Red was currently taking a deep breath. Hurry and hide, hurry and hide. Was she going to be spat at for telling the truth in this day and age? Wait a moment, I have an idea. We can rob. That's right, you can definitely rob other dragons. Considering how powerful dragons were, it would definitely be quite easy to earn justice points. However, based on my understanding of red dragons. But, as far as I know, those guys haven't gone out to earn justice points. Even if they need justice points, they'll just wait to rob us. Are you an idiot? You're the Dragon Queen. You're ordering them to earn justice points so that you can rob them. Just as we were planning our grand plan to earn justice points, an unexpected voice spoke up behind us. Actually, I still have some justice points that my demon agent earned in the mortal plane. The person who spoke up was actually Didina. The demon lord Didina actually had justice points from the mortal plane? Even demons are starting to help people level up and buy justice points? Chapter 629. Originally, I had intended to properly record the Elven Empire's revival and enthronement ceremony. After all, no matter how one looked at it, this was a mega event that would be recorded in history. In order to help with the promotion, I even intended to use the 8-legged essay that I was familiar with to properly write about this historical event and analyze its effects on the entire world. In the year FD8, the Elven Empire's founding ceremony, led by Empress Harlois, was held in the small city of Sindel in Danver. This ceremony symbolized the establishment of the Northland's Elven Empire, and was of great historical significance. The 4 superior elf representatives who participated in this ceremony were the wood elf representatives Kelly and Vonkel, the dark elf representatives Diana, Victoria, and Steele, the moon elf representatives Swana and Marster, and the silver elf representatives Celtus and Cardi. The ceremony ended perfectly in a solemn and dignified atmosphere. It took a total of 11 minutes and 17 seconds. Sorry, I couldn't make up any more stories, because I really didn't know how to properly write about a ridiculous ceremony that took 27 minutes to complete, and 70% of the time was spent reciting the elves' tongue-twisting full names. If I absolutely had to record it, I would probably only be able to record the entire process. The Master of Ceremonies announced that the ceremony had begun, and everyone applauded. The Master of Ceremonies began to read out the names of the main participants. Everyone listened very seriously at first, as perhaps these names would all be major figures in the future who would establish the Elven Empire. Then, the Master of Ceremonies used a perfect retroflex voice to repeat the tongue-twisting Elven language in order to use an operatic accent to shout out the glorious nobles' names. Most of the spectators below fell asleep or spaced out. Considering that time was limited, the Master of Ceremonies only read out the names of the main participants. These were the people who had to be registered as the pillars of the Elven Empire, but this still took 23 to 24 minutes. It would have been fine if it had been a meaningful speech, but the entire process was filled with tongue-twisting, meaningless syllables, as well as all sorts of unnecessary ceremonial words. Perhaps even the elves themselves would find it boring. Fine then, I didn't know if the elves would find it boring or not, but Adam, who was sitting in the first row as a witness for the ceremony, instantly fell asleep as the elves beside him glared at him. Then, it was finally time for the main event. Harloise went up on stage, put on a golden crown, and picked up the scepter that symbolized imperial authority. Then, she gave her first speech since taking office. I swear on my father's name that I will do my best. That's all. Yep, that was all. Then, there was astonishing cheering. Can we finally eat? Adam woke up at this time, his saliva dripping all over the ground. The surrounding elves looked at him with disgust. Although everyone was bored listening to him, he was the only one who didn't give them any face and fell asleep. As for me, I'm going to give him a good account here. Tomorrow, I'm going to send him to the little fairy newspaper and make him famous. How did he offend you? This guy said that he plans to have 12 kids and form a basketball team. He also said that it's not safe now and that he'll have kids after the Holy War. Back then, it was enough for him to leave the group alone, but he actually flaunted his happiness in front of a single man. How could he tolerate this? I want to make him famous. Let him think that his ugly manners will offend those narrow-minded, pointy ears. Why do I feel like Adam is raising a flag, and it's the most dangerous kind? Why did you turn into a cat again? Only now did I realize that although the gold elf on the stage was beautiful and noble, it was only a clone. The real Harloise had landed on my shoulder. In order to prevent others from sniping and killing me, the average emperor and queen's term is far too short these days. I casually said something that even I didn't believe as the black cat rubbed against my face and licked it. It was cold and ticklish. I feel like I'm more at ease like this. You're so sly. My words caused Harloise to pause in surprise. She looked at me in astonishment as if she had seen something rare, such as an ironwood flower or a meteor shower. You're actually enlightened now? Tisk, I've never been an idiot. What do you mean by, I swear on my father's name that I'll do a good job? If your father fell into the cycle of reincarnation and never heard from him, you would probably believe it. But in the current situation, isn't it the same as I swear on Dedina's name that I'll do a good job, and look for her if anything happens? Isn't this just sly? The silly cat suddenly chuckled. She laughed quite happily, and then I laughed as well. Damn it, why are you biting me? And then, a cat-eared hat appeared on my head. Although the ceremony was simple, the meaning behind it wasn't simple at all. First of all, when elven emperors and kings inherited the throne, it would be the elven gods' incarnations or high priests who would put on the crown for them. The kings and emperors would have to thank and worship the elven gods, which naturally meant that the royal authority was under the control of the elven gods. But this time, Harlois directly put on the crown. No elven gods were allowed to watch the ceremony. Those who came without an invitation were all sent back. There were also 2 gods' incarnations from the Hades faction as spectators. It probably didn't need to be explained what this symbolized. After a short half-hour coronation ceremony, the audience continued all the way until midnight. Fortunately, all this work could be done on the floating airship. Otherwise, it would have been quite painful to waste so much time. Yes, audience. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to call it dividing the spoils. A new empire would be established. Although it would become a member of the Mist Alliance, it would still need its own territory, organization, and people. In that case, with people, there would be society, and with society there would be exploitation and classes. I meant the division of labor in society. Perhaps joining the Mist Alliance would be able to break these boundaries. But at this time, it would be best not to provoke the elves too much. Let's first follow the traditional rules. According to the ancient elven tradition of the revived Elven Empire, the 4 superior elves would support the Gold Elves' rule. They would also take away the royalty's authority and glory. In that case, the 4 superior elves' positions, authority, and so on would have to be divided accordingly. Although time was limited and it would be impossible to divide everyone's authority, a general framework would be necessary to calm the elves. Everyone else is fighting to the death, yet you're dividing authority and authority. Isn't this dividing spoils? It's clearly under the Gold Elves' guidance. The 4 superior elves are carrying out their duties based on their natural talents bestowed upon them by the creator goddesses, guiding the elves to a revival. Why does something so honorable become so dirty when you say it? Forget it. Just look at how greedy they are. What's the difference between this and dividing spoils? I'm just always telling the truth. Harlois was rendered speechless. The elves in real life and the elves in fairy tales were similar in appearance. However, there was a huge difference on the inside. These pointy-eared elves were naturally petty and vain. Meanwhile, the superior elves were born above ordinary elves. They were already used to all sorts of conflicts for personal benefit. How could they possibly easily make concessions? For the entire night, we divided spoils, welcomed the elves without stopping. However, what I didn't expect was that none of the temporary leaders of the 4 superior elves were my subordinates. The current leader of the Wood Elves was the forest elf Fenker Vin Kasola. He was a famous great drool among the Wood Elves, as well as a well-known moderate and coexisting drool. It was only natural that he would be recommended as the leader of the Wood Elves. He was only slightly more than 400 years old. He was a ruddy-faced burly Wood Elf. As a Wood Elf great drool, he had just reached the prime of his life. However, it was rather strange that he would tremble slightly when he saw me. Your Highness, we met once before. Back then, I had just become a drool, and you left a deep impression on me. The voice of nature is telling me that your soul has become even more powerful than it was back then. We met before? I didn't remember meeting a Wood Elf great drool before. Hey, did you drop your staff? Why did you run away? Cough, I've heard of him before. He's a survivor of Ice Aeon, and it's said that he has a chronic illness that causes him to shake uncontrollably whenever it snows. You seem to be shaking as well. Harlois' true body was on my shoulder, while her clone was still meeting with the other elves. She was truly capable of multitasking. However, I instantly understood what she meant. Oh, is this a conditioned reflex of eating a popsicle when you were young and breaking your teeth? Whenever you see a popsicle, you'll automatically shiver. I understand now. That's definitely not the same thing. Your family uses Ice Aeon to make popsicles. Damn it, I've been tricked by you. I felt rather uncomfortable as I looked at the great drool who was constantly sneaking glances at me from afar. This wasn't because I was afraid of revenge. It was just that I felt rather disgusted to have a middle-aged man constantly sneaking glances at me, and then suddenly blushing when our eyes met. The temporary wood elf leader was truly a temporary position. That was because there weren't that many wood elves in the Northlands, and this position was mainly to make up the numbers. Naturally, it wouldn't have much authority. However, the other 3 elven species had quite a large number of wood elves. The leader of the dark elves, Steel, didn't have a family name. It was said that she was the younger sister of the holy maiden Lorcie's illegitimate daughter. She was the unlucky bastard who had her body stolen by Harloise. However, she didn't have Lorcie's bloodline. When considering how the Dark Elves' social circle was so chaotic that it was impossible to tell who was who, and how dark their social circle was so dark that everyone was black inside and out, just from what I knew, I could tell that the inside stories and grudges could be written into several novels. Victoria had always been quite ambitious. Her blasphemy priestess job class had already been played to perfection. The entire Dark Elf society no longer had any gods, but there was a large number of believers. Even Anslow had failed to infiltrate the Dark Elf society. I felt that if I ignored her for another 200 years, it would be only natural for her to suddenly ascend to godhood. And her greatest trump card, apart from my support, was that she had an excellent older sister who was quite powerful but not ambitious. The current Diana was becoming more and more like the number 1 Dark Elf sister. It could be said that Victoria now had the most powerful military and religious authority in Dark Elf society. She was the true uncrowned ruler. However, she was quite sly. She didn't intend to become the tribe leader herself, nor did she allow her older sister, who wasn't skilled at politics, to become the tribe leader. If she really tried to forcefully become the tribe leader, I would be on guard against her. Perhaps she would do something. She also knew that I was wary of her, so she had always maintained a humble and cautious behavior. She also didn't interfere too much with Dark Elf affairs. But what she didn't know was that the more she played around like this, the more I felt that she was incredibly scheming and dangerous. Considering how glorious Victoria's past was in the game's history, if I died and no one was able to suppress her, something would likely happen. A puppet, huh? Sorry, I accidentally said the truth. I hurriedly apologized sincerely when I saw that the Dark Elf tribe leader was about to cry. However, the moment I apologized, the little girl really started crying. Although this little girl didn't seem to care about anything, the Dark Elves were actually the strongest of the Northlands elves. They still had their foundational strength, and there were quite a large underground population. Their natural talent for magic resistance would be incredibly useful in the future when the elemental tide became more violent. They had a complete power system to begin with, and they also had powerful job classes like Desecration Priests and Anti-Holy Knight. It was only natural that the Dark Elves would rise. It seems that it's time to suppress the Dark Elves for the sake of balance. I said it out loud. Sorry. Little girl, don't cry. I won't hit you. I'll only suppress you. Alright, I cried even louder. Alright then, I had already scared 2 tribe leaders to tears. I should go off to the side and take a rest. The leader of the Silver Elves was Celtus Rufin Camusi Silverspear. He was an incredibly handsome elf who was a hero on the battlefield among the Silver Elves. He was the core leader of the younger generation, and also one of the main reasons why the Silver Elves had split apart. However, Harloise had an incredibly unfriendly expression when she looked at him. Silver Spear Clan. I would never forget that it was the Silver Spear family that had rebelled against the Gold Elves back in the day. Those 2 Silver Spear family elders were still on Harloise's must-kill list. But now that the Silver Elves had just surrendered to the Gold Elves, it was only natural that they would continue using their current leaders. Without sufficient reason, it would be impossible to change the leaders even if I wanted to. TSK. He even has a pair of electrifying eyes, and he's even fawning over Harlois, his clone. Harlois, as a bystander and the person involved, how do you feel? Silver spear, silver spear, silver spear, all right then. Her avatar's smile was like a flower, as if she was amused by the joke. Her true body, Harlois, was still conflicted. If she didn't grit her teeth and hold it in, something bad would probably happen. It seemed that in the future, this upstart of the Silver Spear family would enjoy being bullied by her superior. As for the Moon Elves, they were the most troublesome. Right now, they still hadn't decided who would be the tribe leader. The rulers of the three Northlands Moon Kingdom of the Elves were unable to come to an agreement, and Swana, who was the closest to us, had adamantly refused to become the tribe leader. I'm already an undead, so how can I be too attached to the authority of the living? Since my species has already survived the calamity, I'm already intending to say goodbye to Her Highness. However, the problem was that there were only 3 Northlands Moon Kingdom of the Elves left. Originally, it would have been quite difficult for them to join the Mist Alliance, and the internal situation was incredibly complicated. For the sake of mutual trust, Swana was the only candidate that both sides were willing to accept. If you leave, who are we going to find to be our scapegoat? It won't be easy to find someone who can be bullied on all sides. After pondering for a long while, I said something that attracted everyone's attention. Or, to be more precise, it scared everyone to the point of collapsing on the ground. Swana, do you want to be revived? I can do it. Chapter 630. Swana, do you want to be revived? This sudden question in public wasn't a sudden thought. It was an important part of my entire plan. This wasn't for the sake of the Moon Elves' internal balance. Actually, the Moon Elves were suppressed by the Dark Elves and the Northlands Kingdom of the Elves, so they wouldn't be able to cause much trouble. Rather than the 3 Northlands Kingdom of the Elves who were already scared witless, I was more worried about Victoria and the Dark Elves, who were becoming more and more powerful. Actually, the main reason why I mentioned reviving Harlois was to save myself some trouble. Harlois was revived, right? The fact that she was alive would be able to withstand any divine art or magic. However, I would have to give an explanation for the miracle of reviving the living. Otherwise, I would be in great trouble. This wasn't some imaginary punishment. This was a real conflict of interest. Perhaps some myth-ranked hero would appear in front of me and take my most important subordinate hostage, forcing me to revive some unlucky individual whose bones had already been reduced to dust. As the saying goes, an innocent man gets into trouble because of his wealth. Even for a vicious and evil person like me, once I'm involved in the greatest miracle of this world, I definitely won't be able to escape unscathed. Countless powerful individuals had lost their most important family members when they were young. Even if they knew that time couldn't be reversed, and that resurrection would require a tremendous price, as long as 10% of them were tempted, I would likely be killed over and over again. In that case, rather than waiting for those people to come looking for me, I might as well find an excuse and tell them the conditions and limitations of resurrection. Even if some people still refuse to give up, most would believe me, which would save me a lot of trouble. Swana, I can resurrect you because you're a natural undead. I wouldn't be so foolish as to tell the truth. Sacrificing a sufficient amount of soul and power in exchange for the resurrection of an undead sounded quite evil and selfish. Although it didn't seem like a good deal, there would always be people who didn't care about other people's lives. I had seen far too many evil cultists who would shout, "I'm only trying to resurrect my family. Who cares about the lives of those lowly commoners? I'm the righteous one." If I really said that I could casually revive undead souls whose souls had yet to enter the cycle of reincarnation, then there would probably be countless massacres and blood sacrifices in the entire continent in a short period of time. Perhaps I would even receive the title of the man who can destroy the world with a mere movement of his mouth. This was no joking matter. As long as there was a chance to revive one's family or loved ones, powerful individuals who were viewed as neutral or evil would unhesitatingly slaughter entire cities for their souls. As for powerful individuals who appeared to be on the side of justice, how many of them would be able to resist the temptation of making up for their lifelong regrets? This is an accidental product of my research. Natural undead are fundamentally different from ordinary undead. The former are closer to living beings, so as long as I create a custom-made body for them, then use my secret technique to make up for the flaws in their souls, they can be completely resurrected. Everything I said was the truth, but it wasn't the complete truth. While it was true that the natural undead had more potential than the living, it was much easier to revive them. However, that didn't mean that it was impossible for ordinary undead to revive. Those who heard my words would likely be misled by me. They would think that what I meant was that Harloise had been able to revive mainly because she was a natural undead. Natural undead, those who don't rely on the power of death and are still wandering the mortal plane, there are probably no more than 10 of them in the entire world. Indeed, natural undead are fundamentally different from ordinary undead. They don't have the unstoppable bloodthirstiness of the undead, nor do they need the power of death to control their physical bodies. Their interactions with their physical bodies are quite similar to the living. From a certain standpoint, natural undead are the souls of the living who have lost their physical bodies. Great Drul von Kor's assistance was truly on point. As an authority on nature and life, his answer was indeed true. His expression as if he suddenly understood something, as well as his usual reputation, made his exclamation seem incredibly convincing and real. Natural undead were the undead who were unwilling to die. They would naturally revive without any external help. Such undead would be incredibly powerful, and they would have far greater growth potential than ordinary living beings. Their birth also represented extreme resentment, most likely the result of some tremendous injustice. Such existences were incredibly rare. The first natural undead in history was Ale, and the most famous natural undead were me, Harloise, and Swana. I was the undying Roland. My undying nature that surpassed the cycle of reincarnation was inconceivable to begin with. Now that I said that natural undead could be revived, it could be said that I had another explanation for my undying nature. Roland Mist was a natural undead, and he himself had the ability to revive natural undead. That was why he was undying. I was probably one of the few existences in the world who simultaneously wielded the power of holy light and the power of death. In the Northlands, I had once used the power of light and darkness to create life, which proved my unique mastery of the soul and life. Not to mention that the other revived person was also the natural undead Harloise. All these facts supported each other, which should be enough to form a convincing chain of evidence. That's right, my method of dealing with this situation was to make the world misunderstand that my method of reviving was limited to natural undead. That way, I would be able to save a lot of trouble. This wasn't a pure lie. It was impossible to revive a soul that had entered the cycle of reincarnation, which meant that it was impossible for me to revive someone who had been dead for a very long time. In that case, if I wanted to revive someone, I would either have to bring their corpse and soul to me in time, or use a vessel to store the deceased soul. This would eliminate 99% of the possibility of reviving someone. Cough, cough, I was getting off topic. At any rate, reviving someone would be far too disruptive to the balance of the world, so it would be better to seal it. I. Everyone turned to look at the Banshee Swana. She was so scared that half of her body turned transparent. It was likely that she had never even considered the possibility of reviving herself. Don't be in such a hurry. You can slowly think about it. I don't have the time to hold a revival ritual for you right now. Once the current troubles are over, I'll go to the Northlands to hold a revival ritual. Relax and don't be afraid. Both Harloise and I succeeded. Reviving a natural undead isn't difficult at all. Everything I said was the truth, as well as misleading. I heaved a sigh of relief as the surrounding elves nodded and exchanged glances with each other. Life and death, reincarnation never ends. Large-scale revivals would definitely break the balance of nature. Perhaps some powerful nature faction individual would jump out and fight me to the death. Occasionally reviving a few would be fine, as the droll individuals who weren't too extreme probably wouldn't go to the extent of fighting me to the death. But when considering how passionate the nature faction individuals were and how dangerous the extreme nature faction individuals were, I felt that it would be best to stay far away from these streaking enthusiasts in the future. If Drool really dares to make trouble for me, I'll send out my special weapon against Drool, Beifong. I wouldn't say this out loud. After all, if I used such a weapon of mass destruction in the mortal plane, I would likely become public enemy number one as well. At this moment, Swanna reacted, but she shook her head as if she intended to refuse. Thank you, Your Highness, but I'm already dead. The rules of nature. I gagged her and stopped her from saying anything. So you mean that Heloise and I should find a place to dig a hole and bury ourselves? Your Highness, I didn't mean that. I patted Swanna's head and rubbed it. Her spiritual body felt quite smooth. Little girl, don't be so stubborn. Learn to accept your elders' good intentions. This is also a type of filial piety. Elder, Swanna paused in surprise as she lowered her head. Her soul flashed, revealing that she was unable to calm down. Oh, you don't know yet, do you? Your father was my very first disciple. If that's the case, then you're in the same generation as my grandson, right? What? Not only was Swanna shocked, even the other elves had expressions of disbelief. The former elven king of the Tassel Kingdom of the Elves was actually Roland's disciple? What kind of ridiculous story was this? TSK. Back in the day, my name was Roland Blackhand. Adrian was my disciple. Are you really unable to find out about this? Back then, he was the one who stabbed me in the back and successfully killed his own teacher. As expected of a new member of our faction. This brat really did a good job. Right, Heloise was the one who taught me magic. She was the one who taught me ice and death magic. I really do have some sort of fate with the elves, hee. I proudly laughed out loud, but all I received was forced laughter. Even the elves probably wouldn't be able to accept the helplessness and shock contained in their laughter. Since it was already revealed, I might as well reveal everything. From a certain standpoint, my fate with the elves was quite deep. The one who taught me magic was the gold elf Heloise, and the magic I learned was used to deal with the elves. I was even tricked by an elven disciple in the process. And I had chosen this path because of the Mist Kingdom's destruction, and the elves had to take the blame for the Mist Kingdom's destruction. I felt like I was in a food chain. The elves betrayed Heloise, and Heloise, who was filled with hatred, taught Emperor Yongye. Emperor Yongye caused the scariest calamity in elven history. The god of fate was right. Sometimes, fate's arrangements were ironic and dramatic. Everything was like fate itself. The cause of betrayal resulted in the destruction of the elves. That invisible chain of cause and effect was truly an indescribable coincidence. Right, Adrian killed his own daughter, and I killed him. It would seem that apart from the tradition of killing one's own teacher, our faction also had the tradition of killing one's own children. Don't forget about it. I'm having a headache. Am I really cursed? It would seem that even the silly cat was unable to handle this messy chain of karma. Actually, we all knew that this wasn't some sort of curse at all. This was purely a master-disciple relationship of using each other. It was only natural that they would scheme against each other and finally kill each other. But now that I had revealed my master-disciple relationship with Adrian, I wasn't simply trying to convince Swanna to accept my good intentions. After all, I hadn't brought up this master-disciple relationship with Adrian when I started the battle against him. It was more to show the elves that Swanna was under my protection, so they should be more careful. Yes, I was obviously worried about the elves. The difference between the short-lived species and the long-lived species was far too obvious. I was truly worried that the elves would cause major trouble if we didn't do anything. Without mentioning anything else, the Mist Alliance was currently implementing a policy of equal opportunity for all species, with equal work and equal treatment. If both elves and short-lived species were to simultaneously work in a certain organization of the Mist Alliance, it would be difficult for the short-lived species to compare to the elves after several decades. All Adrian needed to do was wait for all his competitors to die of old age, and then successfully take over. And after he took over, it was likely that the other elves would take over as well. From a certain standpoint, when abilities were unequal, so-called equal opportunity would only result in unequal results. And if abilities were tied to species, the final result would definitely be that the long-lived and powerful species would take over. Would the short-lived species, which were far more numerous, allow the long-lived species to stand above them? It would only be a matter of time before the long-lived species would take over as well. That was why, although the policy of equal species seemed fair, it wasn't suitable for a magical fantasy world where there were so many differences between individuals. The prerequisite for this policy to be universally applicable was that the long-lived species and abilities were roughly equal. What's the point of thinking so much? If we don't get past the current problem, there won't be any future for us. Harlowe's words caused me to stop thinking. I shook my head and stopped thinking about all this nonsense. Indeed, I hadn't even dealt with the current problem yet. Thinking about the Mist Alliance's situation in half a year's time was rather excessive. Once this is over, I'm going to go edit the laws of the Mist Alliance again. At the very least, I need to make the laws more flexible. Is this some sort of death flag? No, it's just the confidence to continue living. We've already gotten past such a difficult situation, so what's there to be afraid of? Chapter 631. 8 years wasn't a long period of time. The Valkyrie soldiers who had joined the Northlands back then were still young kids, but it wasn't exactly a short period of time either. With sufficient benefits and powerful individuals to call upon, the Northlands had completely taken off after several battles. The distance between the new Mist Alliance and the Mega Empires was probably the distance they needed to prove their strength. This wasn't a peaceful Earth. Since everyone knew that a holy war was about to arrive, any increase in national strength would naturally be invested into the bloodshed land. The Northlands Mist Alliance had been making a lot of money from weapons over the past few years. However, their most advanced and mature weapons and equipment were only for their own use. What? Advanced weapons that hadn't even been labeled had appeared on the battlefields in other regions? They hadn't even seen the Mist Alliance's soldiers before? Perhaps I would see those new weapons in the near future, or perhaps I would never see them again. For example, the super known death RPGs that had a range even shorter than an explosion radius, or the super flamethrower that accidentally purchased unstable known fuel, which would explode after 3 seconds of firing. That thing was called a super bomber by some people, and some countries were actually buying it in large quantities. Over the past few years, the Mist Alliance's military observers, weapons dealers, and engineers had traveled all over the world, producing all sorts of weapons and equipment that had been tested in real battles. However, there were some things that the Mist Alliance didn't buy. The new Borealis airship fleet is the most advanced airship fleet in the entire Mist Alliance. Compared to the original Borealis airship fleet, its hull is longer, its armor is thicker, and its cannons are stronger. I know better than all of you. There's no need to explain to me. After I sent away the engineer who kept rambling on, I began to carefully inspect the airship's data. The new Borealis was the first North Star airship. The airship was 302 meters long and 60 meters wide. It had 20 heavy cannons charged with magic crystals, 4 mage towers for defensive spells, and 1 offensive mage tower. The ship's bow had 2 super main cannons with a maximum range of 30 kilometers. It also had a built-in hangar that could store 16 Vulture Type 4 assault airships, 4 Hurricane Type 2 patrol airships, and 40 Pygmy Phoenix fighter airship. Even if this didn't seem like much, the difference was obvious when compared to the original Borealis airship fleet's data. The Borealis was a super-heavy battleship with a length of 243 meters and a width of 40 meters. It had 9 heavy cannons charged with magic crystals, 7 medium mage towers, 1 super mage tower, and 32 medium and small engineering cannons. The super main cannon at the head of the ship had a maximum range of 30 kilometers. It had a built-in hangar that could store 3 Vulture assault ships. Back in the day, the Borealis could be considered a prototype that the Ottoman Empire had meticulously developed. It was indeed very powerful. Not only could it be used as a powerful gunship, it also had a mage tower on top of it to increase the spellcaster's combat strength, and it also had a small storage cabin for small ship. It could be said that it had all the necessary functions. However, in actual combat, it revealed many problems. The super main cannons would be so powerful that even semi-god behemoths wouldn't be able to withstand them. However, the mana consumption would be tremendous. A mage tower that lacked mana would easily become nothing more than a decoration. And if the mage tower was attacked by an aerial knight, the mage tower would have to rely on the engineering cannons that had been dismantled from the city walls. Using ground cannons to attack an aerial knight would have a terrible range and accuracy that could be ignored. And if the mage tower was to launch a surprise attack on the ground, they wouldn't dare to casually use their main cannons. They would have to rely on the engineering cannons. These cannons were basically the battleship version of a ground attack plane. They would be far too dangerous and wasteful. As for the Vulture assault ships, it was likely that nobody would count on them. The Borealis prototype could be said to be a classic theoretical prototype. It looked quite beautiful, and its functions were quite comprehensive. However, it was full of problems when used in actual combat. Being all-powerful meant being useless. If it wasn't for the fact that I had transformed it into an undead airship with unlimited endurance, it would have sunk long ago. Meanwhile, the new Borealis was obviously a battleship that was only functional. The Borealis gave up on the overly expensive and impractical large-scale mage towers. Instead, it chose to focus on defensive mage towers. It was likely that the main job of the mages on the ship would be to provide protection for the ship and maintain all sorts of defensive spells. The offensive mage towers would probably only be used when an archmage was stationed on the ship. The Borealis also completely eliminated the engineering cannons that were far too outdated. The Borealis instead doubled the number of magical crystal cannons that could use up magical ores and gems. The Borealis also abandoned the mage towers that used up a large amount of energy. The firepower of the Borealis twin cannons was also doubled. It could be said that the Borealis mid-range and long-range cannons were now many times more powerful. The Borealis would obviously rely on airships for ground and air attack. The Borealis changed from battleships to motherships, which doubtlessly meant that this was the Borealis' most important combat function. I also learned from some information that the Borealis actually had nearly 100 Griffin Knight and 12 Aurora Knight stationed on the ship. This doubtlessly meant that the Borealis was determined to strengthen its aerial forces. It was likely that even 2 Dragon Knight Knights would be swiftly defeated. The Mist Alliance's engineers were no idiot. Even if I didn't do anything, they learned from actual combat. They unhesitatingly gave up on the old generation's battleship magic squads and cannons. They instead chose to use motherships and airships, which would strengthen the Borealis' aerial and ground support abilities. This greatly increased the Borealis' strategic importance to the overall battle situation. All 7 Borealis are motherships? I recalled that the few motherships that were still under construction at the time didn't have any mothership. The Borealis are all motherships that have a certain amount of cannons and cannons. The old motherships have either been sold off or directly modified. The new motherships are all primarily airship. Actual combat has proven the advantages of this combat style. However, due to the limited production capacity of our shipyards, only 4 of the Borealis airships have been deployed. I nodded and didn't even ask for the reason. Shipbuilding required a large amount of money. It also required a sufficient industrial, magical, and alchemical foundation. The Northland's industrial foundation was quite weak. I was already quite satisfied that they were able to accomplish this much. It would seem that I had made quite a lot of money from selling weapons over the past few years. After the Borealis were completed, it would also take time and effort to prepare the assault airships and small fighter airship. None of this could be accomplished in a short period of time. Then, are the other 3 motherships empty? No, this time, Her Highness Renee brought the Avalanche Squadron, Silver Cross Knight Squadron, and more than 10 other infantry and knight squadrons. She also brought the Northland's elves, archers, and mages. They'll be useful during the landing battle. There are also 16 adult dragons following the airship fleet. However, they're all young dragons that are around 10 meters long. I nodded in satisfaction. At the very least, it sounded quite reliable for the time being. Renee and her airship fleet had already arrived in front of us. It was just that the new Borealis had been sent to pick us up. As for the dragons, as the Mist Alliance and the underground dragon city became more and more connected, the underground's black and red dragons had already become the Mist Alliance's mercenaries. Apart from the fact that these large dragons were paid ridiculously high wages, they were also highly compatible with the mothership. They were fast, highly skilled in aerial combat, and could even cast spells. This made up for the mothership's lack of agility. Of course, the old dragons were still quite reserved. Little Red's underground dragon city wouldn't be able to command them. The dragons and young black and red dragons didn't have any morals to begin with. They used to have the so-called dignity of dragons, but now that the Dragon's Empress had ordered them to do so, they would be able to maintain their dignity and earn money. Humans' wars weren't that difficult for dragons, and their lives would be in even less danger than robbing someone or running into a dragon slayer. Not only that, their income would be stable, and they would also have a good reputation and honor. Why wouldn't they do this? It would seem that Renee isn't here just to save people. If she was only here to save people, then it would be far more convenient to leave all the airships empty. Since she was here with heavy firepower and powerful warriors, it was only natural that she intended to have a good fight. Her Majesty said that this will be the first direct battle of the Holy War. Our Mist Alliance's first airship fleet needs to fight in style and with vigor. And then the fairies will broadcast the entire battle. That'll make it convenient for them to sell their firearms? The young captain of the new Borealis chuckled but didn't respond. However, his silence proved my inference right. You've already mass-produced the shrunken version of the mothership? The first mothership was delivered to Barty 2 months ago. However, please don't call it the shrunken version. This is Barty's commercial version. I chuckled and didn't say anything else. The mothership's carrying capacity was limited, and it was here to save people. Renee wouldn't be so foolish as to fill it up with elite troop. She probably only brought a squadron of each troop type with her. She intended to use the battlefield to collect data and test the Mist Alliance's troop type's adaptability against the Chaos Abyss's troop. She's really becoming more and more like it. I could only sigh in amazement. Perhaps Renee wasn't an all-round queen who was skilled at managing government affairs. However, in terms of military affairs, the Night Princess's constant victories brought her endless glory. She had excellent foresight, and she always made correct and far-sighted decisions. As the Mist Alliance continued to grow stronger, Renee became more and more famous. She was faintly becoming the leader of the younger generation. It would seem that I truly chose an excellent successor. One day later, the new Borealis met up with the Big Dipper airship fleet again. I met up with Renee again, but this time, her situation was rather strange. Chapter 632. The elves of the Moonwheel capital were probably feeling rather complex right now. The revival of the Northland's elven empire and the return of the Gold Elf Empress was probably a huge blow to their heads. They had wanted to restore the Moonwheel capital's glory and die gloriously in battle in the final moments of the Moonwheel capital, completing the Moonwheel capital's rebirth. But now they were told that the Moonwheel capital wasn't a proper elven royalty. This was a huge slap to their faces. I'm going to sacrifice myself for the Moonwheel Empire. My sacrifice will be worth it. At the very least, it will be recorded in the elves' history and give courage to future generations. What? I've already been expelled from the Moonwheel Empire? I've even been treated as a traitor? If it weren't for the fact that time was extremely tight, the Moon Elf Empress would have been named the most pitiful person of the year. She would have become a joke for a very long time. Not only that, the Gold Elf Empress Harloise had the 3-god equipment, and she also had the loyalty of 4 superior elf species. This was indeed far more legitimate than the Moon Elf Empress. The Moonwheel capital claimed to have inherited someone else's Moonwheel capital, but the Moonwheel capital's Moonwheel capital hadn't even been completely wiped out yet. It would be a joke no matter how one looked at it. Just like other ancient species, the elves valued tradition and orthodoxy. At this time, even the superior elves who knew the truth were starting to waver, let alone the ordinary elves. Even if the elves managed to survive this calamity, it was likely that their dream of becoming an empire would be shattered. This naturally made the Moon Elves, who were the leaders, feel quite awkward. The reason why the Moon Elves felt such complex emotions instead of pure disgust and fear was because the first thing the Northland's elven empire would do after its revival was actually to save their own elves. It was quite obvious that the Moon Elves would accept the Moonwheel capital's assistance, not another country or species. Accepting the Moonwheel capital's assistance would be the equivalent of accepting the Moonwheel capital's authority. But not accepting the Moonwheel capital's assistance. No one would be so foolish as to reject a life-saving straw in such a hostile environment. And so, the Moon Elves fell into a dilemma. However, the demon wave wouldn't give them any time to be conflicted. A tremendous amount of Chaos Abyss's aura permeated the air. The forest that had originally been filled with natural creatures instead became the elves' problem. The wild beasts that were unable to resist the corrosion of the Chaos Abyss's aura turned into chaos beasts. All the villages on the outskirts of the Moonwheel capital were sending out distress signals. The dangerous chaos beasts all desired the taste of flesh and souls. It was impossible to count on the dimensional stability of the Moonwheel capital. There would be reports of demons appearing at any given location. In fact, from the moment that dark clouds covered the sky, it was impossible to see the sun and moon in the sky above the Moonwheel capital. Panic was spreading everywhere. The elves were forced to use the power of nature and the light of arcane magic to maintain the illumination of the Moonwheel capital and calm the people down. However, the extra expenses they had to pay every day made the Archmage and the Great Drool's hearts ache. Although the order to abandon all nearby villages and outposts and return to the Moonwheel City had been given, there were still some elves who hadn't received the order yet. They still hoped that they could try their luck and didn't return in time. When 2 groups of fleeing villagers were attacked by magical beasts, the Moonwheel capital began sending out rangers and Drool to help evacuate the remaining villagers. Even so, nightmarish news kept arriving at the Moonwheel capital every day. It seemed that this was only the prelude to the demon wave, but the elves were already having a hard time dealing with it. Of course, this was nothing more than a facade. The superior elves were currently using this time to train their elite forces and organize themselves into an army so that they could fight as quickly as possible. However, the ordinary elves didn't know that the news of the demon wave's imminent arrival was half confirmed by the village heads and town mayors. Compared to the previous denial from the Elven Empire, the elves were furious and panicked at being deceived. The true Elven Empress will save us. She's coming with reinforcements from the Northlands. She's forgiven our sins. The elves still have hope, this rumor spread at the fastest possible speed. Even though most elves were still skeptical about this, as the ancient events from 10,000 years ago were far too distant from them, the seeds of this rumor were still planted. As for the Elven Empire's officials, they were naturally quite angry. However, there would always be many rumors during a time of war. Even if they wanted to investigate the source, they wouldn't know where to start. The ones who were spreading the rumors were one of us? Would anyone believe me if I said I wasn't? At the very least, this way, our arrival would attract a lot of attention. Everyone would be waving the gold elf flag everywhere, and the rumors would naturally become true. Even if the moon elves wanted to hide it, they wouldn't necessarily be able to. We were willing to help, but we definitely wouldn't do it for free. We weren't idiots who didn't even have a good reputation. In order to spread the rumors even more, it was likely that all the spies in the Moonwheel capital would be rendered useless. The rumors spread more and more, becoming more and more detailed. In fact, even the fact that the floating airships were about to arrive was revealed beforehand. This was an obvious scheme. But, unless the Moon Elves chose to refuse reinforcements, they could only grit their teeth and bear with it. Meanwhile, I had just finished dealing with the messy matters at hand. I was quite surprised to see Renee, whom I hadn't seen for a long time. I saw Renee on the Mizar's bridge. However, there were now two strangers by her side. One of them was a tall, blue-haired female knight. She had a pretty face and a slender figure. Even though she was wearing bright red scale armor, she seemed to have a magical aura about her. This feeling was rather familiar. A dragon descendant? The other one was a black-haired middle-aged lady who seemed to be around 15 or 16 years old. She didn't seem to have much power, but if I wasn't mistaken, her family emblem was a lion and tiger with two shields. That was the emblem of the Marceau family, one of the top 3 mega-families in the Swolo Federation. If they were only strangers, I wouldn't have paid much attention. But right now, one of them was holding on to Renee's left and right hands, and they were sitting on either side of Renee. If I recalled correctly, that meant, "Greetings, Your Highness Roland. I am Helen Winston, Her Majesty Renee's concubine. You should be quite familiar with my older brother, right?" This tall southern beauty had a healthy, tan skin tone that was almost sexy. Judging from her aura, she seemed to be quite decisive. However, she seemed rather hesitant right now. "Greetings, Your Highness Roland. I've long since heard of your great name. I am Ivy Marceau, as well as Your Highness's concubine." The moment this black-haired noblewoman spoke, I noticed that she was even younger than I had expected. Under her purposefully thick makeup, she seemed to be only 13 or 14 years old. Both of them looked at me with astonishment and hostility in their eyes. It was a rather complex expression. I finally couldn't help it anymore and almost spat on the noblewoman's face. The next instant, I noticed that this was a serious breach of etiquette. I hurriedly did my best to stand still and stifle my laughter. "Your Highness Ivy, Your Highness Helen, nice to meet you. I am Roland, miss." And then, I instinctively reached out my hand and asked for a hand kiss. Actually, I was taking this opportunity to lower my head and laugh maniacally. "Ah, little girl Renee, to think that you would have such a day. How interesting." Even if she didn't explain, it would be far too easy to guess what was going on. Renee was the ruler of a country, and she had long since passed her wedding date. In that case, for the sake of the country's stability, she would have to fulfill the most important duty of a member of the royal family, getting married. Even if she didn't want to marry the main wife, it would still be necessary for her to have a concubine. Something like a political marriage was absolutely necessary. And her reputation as the Lily Princess had caused other countries to send female noblewomen to marry her. Most likely, this was a compromise after all normal marriages were rejected. The Lily Princess who had no interest in men should have already spread throughout human society. Right now, Renee had 2 concubines. One was the younger sister of the Bardi Empire's Dragon Knight War Emperor Helent, and the other was a noble daughter of the Marceau family of the Swallow Federation. Both were princesses of mega-empires, and they were worthy of René's status as the most powerful person in the Mist Alliance. This marriage was 100% political, and it represented an alliance between mega-empires. René was unable to refuse at all. This kind of political marriage that involved the royal family also had unwritten rules. It was quite humane. If both parties got along, it would be fine as long as they were normal husband and wife. If they didn't get along, the emperor would still do whatever he wanted. The concubines would be nothing more than decorations in the palace. Whether or not the concubines would be able to find a lover to relieve their boredom would depend on the emperor's generosity. Since this was a special situation, it wasn't completely unprecedented. There were plenty of emperors who were gay in the past. Concubines of the same gender were only kept secret. Everything else was the same as before. René's first wife would definitely have to be male. That was because she would need to have descendants and be recorded in the genealogy, as well as be accepted by the world. She would be forced into a marriage when she didn't have any descendants. That would be quite a joke to watch. I guessed that René was intending to invite two powerful gods to protect her in order to stop the increasingly dangerous forced marriage. However, I noticed that there seemed to be something off about the way these two girls were looking at René. They seemed to be the male version of Her Highness René. Hey, little girl, where did you touch? Where's the reservedness of a concubine? A man's chest muscles shouldn't be touched so casually. The black-haired girl's eyes were filled with love as if she was looking at her beloved lover. But the next instant she came to her senses and hurriedly retreated. However, when she saw my face again, her eyes became hazy again, and she reached out with her small hand again. Heroine, please behave yourself. I took a step back and shook off Consort Ivy's hand, who was still in a daze. Then I glanced at Rain. Her face was filled with helplessness and despair. I couldn't take it anymore and laughed out loud. Ha ha ha, little girl René, to think that you would have such a day. How does it feel to be forced into a marriage? The guards around me instantly took a step back and pretended not to hear me. René shook her head helplessly and pulled on the red bell next to her. All the guards immediately retreated. Things were different now compared to 8 years ago. René was now the true empress. Dignity and such seemed to be quite important to her. Cough, Brother Roland, it's actually like this. The moment René explained, the dragon princess viciously glared at me when she mentioned how to address me. It seemed that she viewed me as an enemy, a love rival. But soon I was attracted by Rain's legendary story. How did she manage to invite two powerful true gods to come back and serve them? Then, she mysteriously went through a series of adventures, and the two concubines that were supposed to be normal became real, and that was it. The more I spoke, the more bitter René's expression became. But in the end, she looked at me with a serious expression. Her eyes were filled with sincere emotions. Actually, we're just pure friendship. Actually, what I truly like is, perhaps it's only friendship right now, but one day it'll be love. A love that's as hot as lightning and fire. The blue dragon princess's eyes were filled with the flames of love as she interrupted René's passionate confession. At this moment, René's expression looked as if she had eaten 2 flies. I almost laughed out loud again. Yep, I believe that heterosexual love should be for the sake of future generations. Only homosexual sacrifice is true love. The moment I said this, the 2 concubines looked at me with much friendlier expressions. It would seem that they were also under a lot of pressure. This was truly amusing. If I wasn't so busy, I would probably laugh for the entire day. But right now, I really did have something to discuss with René, so I could only shake my head and ask her my question. Queen Rain. Your Majesty Rain, I wonder if the ancestor of your bloodline, that bastard younger brother of mine, has contacted you recently? Chapter 633. From a certain standpoint, René had always been raised as a boy who would inherit the throne. After the late emperor passed away, she basically always wore male or knight attire in front of others. Even the words she often used were masculine. Plus, she had the aura of a knight that had been tempered by her long military life. It could be said that if she covered her face, she would probably be even more manly than a man. She had an androgynous face to begin with. She acted manly, had the aura of a valiant military knight, and had great combat achievements that would cause others of her age to fear her. She was viewed as the Princess Charming in the hearts of noble ladies. Prince Charming. For the two concubines, they went from hating a political marriage, to understanding each other, to loving each other regardless of gender, and finally to being infatuated with each other. This was enough for many novels. I meant dramas and operas. Actually, considering their statuses, as long as the story was slightly edited. No, as long as the original story was spread out, there would definitely be novels, operas, dramas, rumors, and so on. People would always be interested in the romantic affairs of the emperors. The more interesting and novel the story was, the more popular it would be. Considering how legendary the Yuri princess was, perhaps many celebrities would be able to make a living off of it. What? I already had a name for this story? Of course, I felt that this story had a lot of potential. I had already decided on the title for my next novel that had a bit of a dirty joke. I would write an adaptation of this true story. Of course, it was quite difficult to satisfy readers' taste. That was why I was going to expand my harem by 100 times and increase the amount of fighting and killing by 10 times. I was going to bully the second young master every day, flirt with beautiful women, and add a few famous historical figures to the story. People like to read about such things, so it would definitely be a hit. Wait a moment, René, why did you draw your sword? Did I accidentally say it out loud again? Tsk, it was all a joke, a joke. No matter what, you were my descendant. Would I casually tarnish the Mist family's reputation? Did I seem like someone who didn't know what was important? Really? Stop talking nonsense. Look directly into my pure eyes. How can there be any filth in them? What, everything is filth and evil. Tsk, you must have seen wrongly. In order to prevent a scene of my obedient granddaughter furiously chasing after a young grandfather, I brought the topic back to the main topic and directly asked René about her demon bloodline. I had previously inspected René's physical condition. Although she had obviously come into contact with the power of chaos and became a knight job class that could control the power of chaos, after so many years of blood transfusion, Cavendish's chaos bloodline should have been replaced by my more neutral bloodline. It was said that Rain had even lost a power level due to her bloodline being weakened. That was because if Carwins had a main god level bloodline, then according to the rules of the Chaos Abyss bloodline, Rain would be able to borrow power from the Chaos Abyss itself. Of course, Rain would also be restricted because of this. However, my bloodline could only rely on myself. Moreover, the instability of her bloodline seemed to have caused her to suffer from intermittent migraines, and her temper was much more irritable than before. In the long run, this was probably a good thing. After all, having something that completely belonged to you was the most practical. The system's improved version of the people of the Mist bloodline would probably be on par with the Chaos bloodline. At the very least, it would be more suitable for the mortal plane. As her bloodline was purified, René's potential would also increase. However, her power level would definitely decrease for a short period of time. Since she was a Chaos Knight, the demons and chaos creatures she summoned would definitely not be as obedient as before. That was because she used to have a powerful existence protecting her. Of course, the arrival of the demon wave meant that the dimensional door to the Chaos Abyss would be opened. Chaos Knight job classes, such as Chaos Knight, Black Knight, Dark Cultists, and Demon Warlocks, would become even more powerful. However, it was no longer necessary for René to rely on her personal power level. What was worth mentioning was that Glena's Chaos Bloodline ritual had been completed even earlier. However, just like Rene, Gleena didn't need to rely on the blood of the Chaos Abyss, as she was both a great engineer and a queen. I had originally thought that Cavendish would do something before his bloodline was completely changed. But strangely enough, ever since the world of Hades, he hadn't contacted me at all, no matter if it was direct or indirect. He had even gone so far as to throw away a very important chess piece like Rene. But now, the dimensional door to the Chaos Abyss was about to open, and it was obvious that Cavendish was also involved. What was his goal? Why would he take the risk of being injured and personally injure Anslo in Anslo's divine domain? All for the sake of a single elf? To completely destroy the elves? Was there really such a great grudge between them? I wasn't afraid of an opponent stronger than me. However, I was indeed rather worried about an opponent who I didn't even know my strategic goals. Has Cavendish contacted you recently? Since I had my doubts, I directly asked. Rene and Cavendish had once had a soul connection with each other. If Cavendish really did have any plans, it was highly likely that he would know. Perhaps it was a word, or perhaps it was a thought. Nobody would be able to completely control their own brain. Even a soul connection was possible. This was also why I had completely excluded Rene and Gleena from the Hades plan back in the day. Rene fell into deep thought upon hearing this. After a long while, she seemed to think of something, but then she hesitated. Just say whatever you think. Don't be afraid of saying something wrong. I'm just asking. My ancestor seems to be looking for a certain place that seems very important to him. A certain place. I was rather surprised by this answer. He wasn't looking for the holy war itself? Or was he looking for a certain place? What kind of place would be so important? I shook my head. I didn't intend to dig any deeper. This information wouldn't be very accurate. It was also possible that Rene was intentionally using it as a smokescreen. It could only be used as a reference. If I paid too much attention to it, I would end up being led around by the nose. Two other pairs of beautiful eyes filled with hostility and vigilance caused me to give up on chatting with Rene. I directly ignored Rene's imploring gaze and said goodbye to her. Since I knew that I would be facing a demon wave, no amount of preparations would be excessive. I should hurry up and do some proper business. There should be a shipborne archmage here. Let's go talk to him about the Mage Tower's improvements and preparations. Perhaps he'll be useful. The 7 floating airships formed a squadron. They didn't choose to fly above the clouds. Instead, they chose to fly over densely populated areas. This wasn't just a military operation. It was also a political operation. The attention they attracted along the way made the eyewitnesses feel the urgency and nervousness of an impending winter. Meanwhile, the situation in the Moonwheel capital was becoming ever more tense. The great majority of the elves had already entered the Moonwheel capital's territory. However, the sturdy city walls and magic towers didn't give them much of a sense of security. The dark clouds above their heads were becoming thicker and thicker. Gigantic bolts of lightning were constantly flashing, pressing down on them. As the aura of the Chaos Abyss became thicker and thicker, not only were a few young elves beginning to mutate, even many divine beasts were beginning to feel ill and ill. Of course, it wasn't all bad news. The good news was that the elemental tide was rapidly increasing at a visible rate. The elven archmages' mage towers and mana pools were mysteriously filled to the brim. Their various defensive magic arrays were also becoming significantly more effective. Not only that, the elves' magic power was actually increasing as well. Every day, the elves would hear that some mage or magic knight who had been stuck at a power level for many years would suddenly break through. It was as if the elves' daily progress was equivalent to a year's progress. However, this actually caused the elves' higher-ups to panic even more. That was because the Chaos Abyss creatures, who were accustomed to a high magic environment, had an even greater advantage. Another piece of news that brought both joy and worry was that the elven gods' divine miracles would occasionally appear. The elven gods' priests and priests would be walking around the elves' crowds to comfort them. Reclusive Holy Temple Knight and God's Grace Ranger would be walking out of the forest to join the elves' defense. In fact, even the true gods' incarnations had been witnessed. At the very least, the elven gods are on our side. The reason why this news was said to be both joy and worry was because some people had already noticed the problem. The gods were unknowable. Distance would bring worship, and worship would bring faith. The gods of faith would always carefully maintain a certain distance from their believers. Divine miracles couldn't be performed too often. This wasn't because it would consume too much divine power. Instead, it was because divine miracles would decrease the mysteriousness that would bring faith. The frequent appearance of divine miracles meant that the elven gods cared about the moon elves and valued the demon wave. But it also meant that even the elven gods had been forced into a corner. Actually, it would be easy to understand the elven gods' current predicament if one analyzed the situation. They were probably even more anxious than the mortals. The current elven gods were the third generation of elven gods. Most of them were gods of faith. More than 80% of their believers were elves. Their greatest source of faith was the Moonwheel Capital and the elven species. If the Moonwheel Capital was destroyed in the demon wave, it was likely that a large number of elven gods would either lose power levels or fall into eternal hibernation. Meanwhile, the Northland's elven empire had already clearly announced that the gods of the Hades were supporting them. The rise of an empire would often be closely related to the rise of a god or a god faction. It wasn't important whether or not the Hades gods needed the elves' faith. The important part was that the elven gods really needed the elves' faith. The elven gods didn't have faith or believers. They didn't even have a main god-level god who could support their god faction. As long as the new elven empire was destroyed, the elven gods would truly be finished. Not only that, these things couldn't be told to mortal believers. The gods' frequent interference can only mean that they don't have any confidence in the upcoming demon wave at all. It was likely that the gods would definitely interfere with the demon wave this time. And as the Holy War officially began, the elemental tide would increase exponentially, and the chaos abyss would be directly connected. The gods wouldn't only send their incarnations. Gods would meet each other bare-chested? This was rather comical and pitiful. Since when had the elven gods, who once ruled over the entire world, fallen to the point where they had to personally participate in the first demon wave? Not only that, it was highly likely that they would lose. Misfortune would always come in pairs. What one feared would happen. When the final dimensional crack was destroyed, the demon army would arrive. Perhaps the elven god faction's twilight of the gods would soon arrive.